That, okay. Do you want to talk?
I was just going to comment. Yeah, no surprise. Okay.
You're very quiet.
Yeah, you are very quiet, Matt.
Oh, am I? That's strange.
Like incredibly quiet.
Okay, hold 1 second.
And Matt, I just made you, oh, I think he's gone now. Uh-oh. I made him a co-host. Sarah, I'm going to make you a co-host too, just in case. All right. Should I let everyone in or wait for Matt to come back?
Wait, is this
That's
better
good.
now?
Yes.
Much better.
That's better, yes.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to bring him in, all right?
Yep.
Merry Christmas to you all.
Hey, Jana, are we all set?
I think so. It looks like there's one person that's still trying to join.
Okay. If I might ask, for the sake of my management of the meeting, if we could play with the video currently, just to make sure that the board members and the consultant are in my view, so I can direct things, please.
And what do you mean?
I've got like multiple screens of other residents and other visitors on the screen too. It's just making it kind of hard to follow where voices are coming from.
I'm not sure if you can put board members in the first 5 categories or first 7 slots. I'm not sure.
You can pin multiple people now.
Okay.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
Let's get going. I'll muster through. We will call to order. Welcome to this regular meeting of the Planning Board of the City of Birmingham for Wednesday, January 13th, 2021. Could we please call the roll?
Scott Klein.
I am present here in the City of Birmingham.
Robin Boyle.
Here, City of Birmingham.
Stuart Jeffries.
Here, Birmingham.
Bert Kosick.
Here, City of Birmingham.
Daniel Scher.
I'm in Birmingham and I'm here.
Brian Williams.
Present, Commerce Township.
Janelle Whipple-Boyce.
Here, Birmingham.
Jason Emmerich.
Jason is muted. If we could unmute him, please, so he could. Nassim is as well, if she's coming up.
I'm here, Birmingham, Michigan.
And Nassim Roman.
Here in Birmingham.
Thank you.
Excellent. Full house. I appreciate you. Welcome. Happy New Year to you and to all of you joining us tonight. Let us move on to the review and approval of the minutes from our last meeting, Wednesday, December 9th, 2020. Do we have any comments or corrections to those minutes? I see no hands going up, and I'm staring at Mr. Scher intently.
Move the approval of the minutes is submitted.
We have a motion by Mr. Scher to approve. Do we have a second?
Second.
I have a second by Mr. Kozik. Do we have any conversation on that? Hearing none, if we could please call the roll.
I'm honored. Daniel Scher.
Yes.
Bert Kosick.
Yes.
Brian Williams.
Yes.
Janelle Whipple-Boyce.
Yes.
Robin Boyle.
Yes.
Scott Klein.
Yes.
Stuart Jeffries.
Yes.
Excellent. Motion passes. So we will move along to chairperson's comments. And I do have a few. Again, I'd like to welcome everybody to this first meeting of 2021. We are back tonight to continue our detailed discussion of the first draft of the master plan as presented to us. Because of perhaps a bit of holiday hangover and the time that has passed, I felt it appropriate to reiterate how tonight will work and actually what we are really doing tonight, particularly for those residents that are here to join us. I am thrilled to see 90, almost 100 people at today's meeting. which is by far the largest participation we have had, which is fantastic. Let's begin with why we're here. Very quickly, and board, if you will quickly indulge me. So the city of Birmingham, as all communities, are required under state law to have a land use master plan and must update it on a regular basis, which is exactly what we're in the midst of doing. The city has hired the consultant team, who you will hear from, to lead this process that has been going on for, frankly, nearly 18 months to 2 years, if memory serves. And they have presented us over the course of the last few months, different chapters of the first draft of this plan. There are a couple important points for everybody here tonight that I'd like to just quickly go over. This is a first draft, and a draft is what I cannot emphasize more. It has been prepared by the consultant team based on input and feedback from numerous public engagement events over the course of the last 2 years. It's not something currently proposed by the city or by this board. It is something being vetted by this board. It certainly is based on best practices around the nation and other recommendations. But to be blunt, it includes some things that this board has not talked about, that the community has not reviewed and addressed, which is precisely why we're here tonight. It is indeed a first draft of this master plan. We will continue through this week, this meeting, talking about neighborhood housing policy. Next month, during our meeting in February, we will continue to talk about the neighborhood plans and the recommendations that are proposed. And we will finish up, I believe, in March with one final conversation about the remainder of the plan, at which point the consultant will be given, has been given along the way, a bunch of direction, and we'll come back later this year with a second draft in which we will start this process up again of reviewing that second draft and moving the plan forward, hopefully. We've broken this down into chapters to make it a little easier to digest. We have, as I said, 107 people here tonight, including the board members. One of the primary purposes tonight is to hear from the public, and we're going to do that early. Once the consultant provides a brief presentation on the concepts to be discussed tonight, I am going to turn it over to the public. However, I do ask a few things of you. With 107 people present, we need to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak who wants one, but we also need to make sure we do so with, as Professor Boyle might say, with some alacrity. Please be succinct. Please try not to repeat things that your fellow residents have stated. Simply, indicate that you agree. Do your best to try and preserve time for others to speak. We do have limits on this. We do need to get through this process tonight. So I do want to make sure everybody has an opportunity. All right. When we go to public input, you will do indicate you'd like to speak by using the raise hand feature. If you are not familiar with Zoom, it is in the bottom center console. There's a little icon, raise hand. When you press that, I have a list of all the individuals here, and some have already found that button. Cheaters. I will do my best to go through the list in the order I see them. I will call your name and/or telephone number if that's how you called in. When I do so, you will be unmuted, and I will ask you to just state your name for the record and then provide your succinct comments. Lastly, I would just like to state that tonight's meeting is about the first draft of the master plan. No action taken tonight will have any immediate implications to zoning changes or any other change to our ordinance. A master plan is a framework. It is something that we would be building toward over the course of the next 20 years. So I do just want all who are here to understand that anything that is discussed tonight, in addition to being a first draft, is not going to go into effect tonight. Tonight is an opportunity to discuss. And with that, we are all residents of this fine community. All of the members of the board are volunteers who are here trying to help make this community better. Let's do our best to treat each other with dignity and respect, and try not to get lost into rhetoric and or misinformation. And with that, Jana, is there any change to the agenda that you're aware of?
There is not.
All right. With that, then, we will move into our main event, the review of the first draft of the 2040 Plan, Neighborhood and Housing Policy. Matt Lambert, I think Sarah Traxler, you're also here. Our fine consultants, please welcome. And I'll give you the floor for a brief presentation on policy.
All right. Thanks, Scott. I'm just pulling this up. I have a slightly different setup today than usual. So hopefully everything works out normally. So thanks for that opening, Scott. So we'll be discussing tonight elements of neighborhoods in the next meeting as well. We've divided the topic so that we could focus really on housing and zoning first, and then move on to details of neighborhood structure, destinations, parking, and transportation in the following meeting. So we want to give today's topic space as it's been the subject of a lot of feedback. And as Scott mentioned, we're sort of presenting things that are in the first draft, and we've gotten feedback along the way, but we're presenting these ideas as we're in the draft, and we've also, along with the board, had some discussion as well. So there's been feedback that we all look forward to incorporating into the second draft and reviewing again. There's been some misinformation shared about this first topic, such as proposing multifamily everywhere, which is not what is being proposed. But I know we've proposed things that are going to be disagreeable, and that's what we're here to discuss. We're still reviewing the first draft in its original form, as I said. Tonight's topic has a good deal of nuance, so please try to absorb the detail, as that's going to help us hone where and how to make changes for the future. So before we get into the details of the plan, Sarah encouraged me to cover some of the numbers that were in the plan because we've received a lot of questions and comments about these. So in the upper left-hand corner of this, and this will really be the only one that has all this sort of numbers on screens, but in the upper left-hand corner is Semcog's analysis of regional projected growth. That's the area's metropolitan planning organization. Here they estimate that Birmingham's portion of regional growth is about 1,700 new people by 2040. Those new residents are anticipated to be older adults in general, who have smaller household size than the regional average, since they tend not to live with children, which equates to about 900 housing units of anticipated growth. So here in the first draft, we'll point out that we made a mistake in what we stated, and we stated that the anticipated growth is 2,000 units. It's actually less than half of that. So we wanted to correct that for the record and have that as a piece of discussion going forward. So that's one piece of this, is the 900 housing units of anticipated growth. And while that can all be absorbed in downtown, other details are also important in considering housing policy. On the bottom left is MISHDA's, the state's regional analysis of housing by income level. Unlike many other regions in the country, Metro Detroit has a deficit of homes at or above $400,000. They had estimated about 240,000 units just regionally that there's a demand for at this, what is otherwise a higher price range. A study doesn't look specifically at Birmingham, and Birmingham receives much of the region's demand at this price point. So the demand for homes in Birmingham means the city could grow beyond Semcog's projection if a choice to allow that growth were made. On the top right, with the City Hall in the image, is an estimate of what would be reasonably priced for a home or rental of an average city employee compared to, say, what the average resident could afford. And this demonstrates that many of the people who work in the city cannot afford to live in the city. There was a lot of discussion throughout the process about this. On the bottom right is an estimate of demand for housing in Birmingham at both at lower price points and at different types of homes. And that's based on income levels and housing stock specifically within the city, which was found at about 600 units. And that's an analysis that we had done with some of the other numbers that existed. But to put it all more simply, there's some natural demand for growth, less than we discussed in the first draft, but there's also significant pressure on the city's housing stock, driving up prices, and that exacerbates a lack of attainably priced housing. When we began this, we were asked by city leaders to address housing cost, and also by residents who we discussed with early on in the process and throughout the charrette. And it's not so simple. So we're going to jump right into the SEAMS portion of the proposal. And really we'll talk mostly about this. I really hope that we can understand the nuance to this part of the proposal. First, the reason for the name. And we're not marketing people, but the reason for the name is, what might go into SEAMS, we'll discuss that shortly, but to address the future housing price concern and growth of future families in the city, we had to look beyond just downtown and the Triangle District. Those areas can accommodate quite a lot of growth, in that sort of Semcog number. But really, they're only going to accommodate essentially multifamily growth in these areas due to the land values. And that's great for supporting downtown shops and restaurants, but not that helpful in accommodating young families, for instance. If growth were to occur anywhere else and not in large multifamily buildings, we ask the question, where might that make sense? Certainly not in the middle of single-family neighborhoods, where we should be discouraging change. So we look to a typical structure of a neighborhood, which is what much of Birmingham historically resembles, and find that there are often busier streets that tend to separate neighborhoods, like Lincoln, Southfield, Coolidge, Maple, and 14 Mile. And since being on a busier street is not that great for a single-family home, these locations made the most sense to consider change if that were to occur outside of downtown, the Triangle District. We use the term neighborhood seam as a way to label these locations with the goal that the name and the definition of the name discourages the movement or the encroachment of that type of housing into the middle of neighborhoods. Often if you choose a term that is ambiguous, then you may get some encroachment of that into an area that you don't want. So we're trying to find a term that really defined the location that this might be appropriate. But before we get into the details, as Scott mentioned, timeline's important. Master plans don't result in changes tomorrow, and we're eager to modify the first draft and review a second. But supposing these concepts were adopted, this year, just to say, change in the ground, even the quickest, would be well in the future. The master plan establishes future land use categories and recommended future actions for commissions, boards, and staff over time. Focusing on SEAMS, there are 3 significant actions that would be required on the side of the city before the housing market might have the opportunity to encourage any actual change on the ground. Most of those also include further public input first. The master plan insists that new housing within SEAMS, if the SEAMS concept is adopted in places, should be subject to design controls and design review, unlike existing single-family homes. And those controls would need to be developed and adopted. I don't imagine that would happen very quickly. And along with this, zoning categories would need to be written or modifications made to the transition zones as a way to get there. But either way, you have zoning modifications that would be necessary. And beyond the SEAMS, the master plan recommends the zoning both in neighborhoods, I'll talk about that later, and mixed use areas be overhauled. In neighborhoods, this has to do with the lack of correlation between the current zoning, setbacks, heights, and so forth, and existing housing. Which is why tear downs are felt as incompatible. And if a zoning overhaul is done, that should really be done all at once, and that takes time. And following an overhaul, properties would have to be rezoned as well. And so at all these points, there's space for input and development of these concepts. Only then would property owners have the opportunity to redevelop or sell properties for redevelopment, and that means change would be slow and it wouldn't happen all in one place. And finally, anything new should be subject to design review and approval. So for what it's worth, we're not talking about tomorrow or next year. Change, if accepted, would be, here we say optimistically 8 years in the future, if not longer than that, most likely longer. So, so why are we doing this? Or why are we suggesting this? It's important to look back really at where we began in the housing process. The Semcog and MISTA figures that I talked about, they weren't our initial concern. We thought Birmingham might need to be a better regional competitor, as was true in downtown years ago. But instead, we heard from some of the public and from commissioners who were concerned with rising housing prices. There were some older adults who wanted to downsize within the community but didn't have anywhere to go. And there was a lot of concern with increasing teardowns within neighborhoods that were perceived as changing the character of neighborhoods. And we also heard some concerns about fewer students attending local schools. Birmingham's neighborhoods are really so desirable that the pressure driving up prices is leading to these outcomes. And the inability to downsize within one's neighborhood pointed towards a very limited diversity of housing as one of the culprits. This also limits families with school-aged children who often cannot afford to live in the city. And as is often discussed elsewhere, that most of the city's valuable public sector employees and in-town workers can't afford to live locally either. A well-established means of decreasing the average cost is to provide housing that is smaller and occupies less land. But only later did we visit the growth projections and regional housing needs assessment, which supported some of those concerns voiced related to available options for housing. So again, as we reviewed, Semcog said Birmingham should anticipate about 1,700 new residents by 2040, roughly 900 housing units. However, given the quality of Birmingham overall, it could easily grow to more of that if that was accommodated or desired. At the moment, growth is not accommodated. It was restricted in 1980, and we have focused a lot on why it might be considered. But the amount of growth really remains an open question. You could choose not to grow, with some consequences like increased housing costs and narrowing demographics. Of course, growth alone doesn't solve those issues. But as I imagine, the conversation has gone in many circles. If you grow too much, that might threaten neighborhood quality and character, also important. So our first target for housing really is downtown. It needs more residents to be vibrant, especially to support more local serving businesses and food options at broader price points. And you've seen, before COVID, you had already started to see some of the more attainably priced options for dining sort of moving out, while some of the established places that serve primarily dinner are being retained. And that has a bit to do with an imbalance of having a certain price point at a lunchtime crowd and a certain price point in the evening. But both areas, even downtown, requires policy change to support new housing, and that's included in the master plan. And while that can account for all of your projected growth, due to land value, it would be entirely multifamily, condo, or rental. And that's great for some demographics, but not for others, like growing families. Other types of housing, particularly smaller single-family houses, duplexes, and townhomes, are either wholly restricted or unlikely to be built due to the current regulations. And to accommodate this smaller scale of growth, we developed the concept of SEAMs and discussed accessory dwelling units. So with that background, I'll finally discuss the SEAMs proposal. And I ask again to consider where SEAMs are proposed, at what intensity are they proposed, and what type of housing might be allowed at that intensity. And, not being marketing people, we say low, medium, high intensity, bad terms, right? But hopefully that is clear enough to have a conversation about what types of housing might fit in low intensity, medium intensity, or high intensity, and then where those are allocated. So how intense, we anticipate these items, all of these will change, where, what intensity, and what goes into them from the first draft. Where some may be removed, others added, how intense. Most likely intensities would be lowered. We've discussed that when we were talking about Haynes Square and housing in the Triangle District in downtown. And really what type of housing would be allowed in the different types of seams. For instance, we didn't really anticipate that a duplex would be very controversial, but we certainly anticipated that 3, 4, and 6 unit buildings might be. And even if they look like large houses, as we've built in many places. As a result, I'd now anticipate after feedback that low intensity seams may remove duplexes and that multifamily would be adjusted in other areas. So please keep in mind that the questions of where, how intense, and what should be allowed in those intensities are important for clarifying feedback. So included in the seams proposal and in this map is also a lowering of density in some places. The yellow areas here were identified as places where you should consider allowing properties to be combined so that larger single-family homes may be built on larger lots. This trend elsewhere in the community became an issue, and we suggested that rather than entirely banning lot combinations in larger homes, that they be allocated to places where they might accentuate neighborhoods. For instance, Oak through Holy Name and Court Lake Estates, Lincoln, where Lincoln dips down to the Rouge. And those might feel more grand with consistently larger homes on larger lots. Like other seams, these are at the edge of the diagrammatic neighborhood, except in Court Lakes Estates, which is quite large, and along Stanley Boulevard, which has a unique and really lovely median, which you don't really have elsewhere in the city. So these areas are included in the discussion of seams, but it's not an increase of housing. So it's just important to know this concept because it's on the map, but it's something different. We've also identified areas that already have housing types that are not single family, and we've absorbed these into seams for convenience. Most, in fact, happen to be in places that would already be considered seams at the edges of neighborhoods. But this proposal is not intended to change these areas necessarily, though it may allow for some of the lower quality examples of housing to be redeveloped following new design controls. And I understand that Ann Street is a concern, and we didn't expect that before since there's a number of existing multifamily buildings there. But it's certainly not all multifamily. And essentially all of the existing multifamily buildings on Ann Street, I would hope would not be acceptable by future design controls. So I'm sure we'll discuss that quite a bit later. So the medium intensity, I think I missed one. There we go. The remainder of the actual seams propose a little bit more and different types of housing. The first one is the high intensity seams. These are areas of significant activity due to their adjacency to downtown or busy streets and intersections. This set of seams allows housing or proposes to allow housing to include accessory dwellings, townhomes, cottage courts, which are multiple small houses on a property with a shared open space, duplexes, triplexes, 4 and 6 unit buildings. The image at the top right, by the way, is a 4-unit multifamily building, just for reference. Smaller than most of the multifamily on Ann Street, for example, and we built these in plenty of places. The medium intensity seams, and there's more of these. This is probably the bulk of what we've drawn. These include a number of existing non-single family sites, as well as housing along some of the more heavily trafficked roads like Coolidge and East Maple, East Lincoln, and 14 Mile. These are proposed to allow accessory dwellings, townhomes, cottage courts, duplexes, triplexes, and 4-unit buildings. Again, that 4-unit building is smaller than what's on Ann Street, and in some cases, like North Eaton, smaller than what currently exists there. But that's what the original proposal has. The low intensity seams, these cover the remainder of the seam areas. They're mostly concentrated on the west side of town, where properties are already larger. These are proposed to allow accessory dwellings, duplexes, and cottage courts. While the seam along Corton seems like a little bit odd, we assigned that one because the properties are quite substantial, and the roadway next to them is high speed and suburban in nature. We didn't think that was really good for for duplexes or things, but really good for cottage courts in that location. So really that's the detail on seams, and I have a few more things to cover, but I'll try not to go, trying to be relatively quick. The seams aren't one thing and they're not everywhere. The concept is rooted in the goal of housing type diversity, principally in accommodating accessory dwellings, duplexes, cottage courts, and townhomes. We also include small format multifamily in some locations because those function at a different price point and format than, say, downtown multifamily. Seams are really less about absorbing growth than they are about diversifying housing stock to allow for more population diversity, downsizing within neighborhoods, and housing for young families. We felt that defining seams as between the neighborhood, not within, as was discussed, would be a first step to limit their location. These really aren't things that are proposed inside of neighborhoods. And from here, we determined that a few types were needed, those of higher intensity near active places, those of lower intensity and quieter places, which may be limited to just a few clusters of smaller homes. In the first pass, we assigned housing types to each seam and allocated them first along more major roads and next between neighborhoods. We anticipate that the location and types may need to change, and also what type of housing is in each of them. But we feel that the future land use concept is useful. It's a good one. Housing diversity is important. Birmingham halted that in 1980, and many other cities did. But now that's changing across the country. But elsewhere, it's being done in a pretty crude and broad manner, in my opinion. A broad approach is not appropriate here. So we've given this a lot of thought, but of course are open to input. We believe the city would benefit from more diverse housing options and price points if there's a means of accommodating that in a way that retains or enhances the quality of neighborhoods. So that was a lot of time on seams, but it's the most complex item to discuss. But I don't want to leave aside the other things that fall on housing policy. The first is accessory dwellings. These have been included in the seams proposal. And also we had recommended them in the MX and R4 through R8 zones, which are sort of the higher intensity zones that already exist. The recommendations for these included additional setbacks for outbuildings if there were dwellings in them, along with landscape screening. We haven't really been specific about where else they should be allowed, but have analyzed some of the existing accessory structure standards for modifications that would be needed if they were allowed. We've heard some concern in prior meetings about ADUs on some of the smaller properties, like the ones in the diagram here. So yeah, maybe 40 feet is too narrow to allow for that. I think that's a good point of discussion. Yet there's certainly sufficient room on larger properties. And, accessory dwellings they're advantageous for the property owner as additional income, as a place for a property owner to move when renting the main house, and as a way to accommodate growth with generally low impact. Though note in what we had recommended, there's some text in there about not allowing both an accessory dwelling and a primary home to be rented. And, I don't know if you've seen the maps, but you have a lot of rental properties, even of single family homes at different sizes. Also to note, we've permitted accessory dwellings in many of our high-end projects. When they're permitted, as with other things, they don't just show up everywhere. They're not ubiquitous. Really, only a small percentage of residents construct accessory dwellings when they are allowed. Overall, we feel they're a good way to accommodate older adults who want to downsize, but principally when they're at the ground level, and there's more than one type of accessory dwelling. Everybody goes to the above garage type and, the concerns with stairs and so forth, but there are types that are within the primary home or a single level outbuilding. So there's, a few other options, also good for young singles and kids moving back from college in the summer. So considerations for where to allow them may be based on lot size or neighborhood or district or just in seams. In our high-end developments, accessory dwellings have increased property values actually. Interestingly, we have an office in our Kentlands development where one of our designers first lived in an apartment on the main street, then moved to an accessory dwelling unit, and finally was able to buy a house when his second child was in the picture, all sort of within a few blocks of each other. So I've already touched on zoning, but I want to reiterate that zoning changes are not only for the seams in the recommendations, but also to better coordinate existing housing with the code, with what the code allows to be built. Right now, there's some significant issues where new homes may be built with shallower setbacks and much greater height than existing homes. Rather than the current system, which is mostly based on lot size, we think the code should also evaluate the character in different neighborhoods for the appropriateness of standards. We don't propose a solution in the first draft. Rather, we recommend that it be studied. Study how current zoning aligns with existing housing, and that the code be modified so that the zoning allowances better match the existing housing stock. We also had a number of discussions about encouraging housing additions rather than reconstruction. Older homes tend to lack amenities of newer homes, and so you often get teardowns. But some strategies may be developed to encourage additions and renovations instead, such as allowances for lot coverage, fast tracking permits, tax abatements were discussed. The master plan doesn't intend to determine the mechanisms, rather to direct that it be studied. We noticed also some examples of excessively bright lighting around the city and suggested that standards be developed to avoid excess light spillover, perhaps starting with the international dark sky standards, as well as some considerations for color temperature. There are other zoning related issues that residents brought up, especially with concern of water runoff. And that tends to appear to be an issue of code enforcement of new construction rather than regulation within the zoning code. So thanks for your patience. I hope that was brief enough. I intended to be brief, and I appreciate the feedback and input. And we want to keep this focused on zoning, seam locations, intensity, housing types, accessory dwelling units, and future growth. And we'll talk more about issues of parking and transportation and other issues in the next meeting.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate that fine presentation. All right, so board, before we dive in and provide our input, comments, and questions, I think it's only appropriate to go to the public. I'd like to do that now. So again, if you would use the raise your hand feature in the bottom center of your console, I will do my best to go in the order I see them. When I call your name, please state your name and then provide your comment, and just please be brief so that we can make sure that everybody gets a turn if they so choose. So we will start with Eleanor Smith-Litt. Ms. Litt, if you could bring her in, please.
Okay. Concerned citizen put his hand up before I did. I just want to be fair.
I will go to concerned citizen absolutely next. But since we've got you teed up, why don't you go ahead with your comments first, please?
Okey doke. I take issue, and I don't.
I'm sorry, just for the record, you are Ms. Litt?
Yes, I am.
Okay, thank you. Just for the record, we're taping. We'd like to make sure we know who comments.
That's fine.
So please go ahead.
I take issue with Matthew's presentation only because it was a lot. And usually when I speak in committees, in education, there's an agenda. There's something, I know there was an agenda on your site, but there was no agenda that I could look at, and I needed it slower, to tell you the truth. It was just a lot, and perhaps it was just too much for me to process at this time. I can tell you how I feel about Birmingham as it is. It's busting at the seams. If you go on to neighborhood.com, and I think a lot of people here are part of neighborhood.com because that's where a lot of us have been meeting and talking about this. And I have to admit that when you're unaware, the only change is to become aware, and that's what I'm doing now. I have to say that driving down Lincoln in the morning when I go to work is a nightmare when COVID isn't happening, and I hope it won't be happening forever. Speeding is a constant topic of conversation. I can't see where adding more cars is going to help the parking situation. When I consulted one of the maps, green was parking. I had to take a magnifying glass out, and I didn't see any addition of parking that was labeled green. I hope I'm correct in the color. I have to speak on behalf of a fellow neighbor who put things so well in terms of sewage and flooding in his basement. If I could share my screen, I'll show you pictures that are a nightmare. And I can't see, sometimes things are not thought ahead far enough in terms of infrastructure. We've already gone through the ripping apart of all of our home in front of our homes, and we've had new sewers put in, and we're still paying for that. I have to say pointedly that my home is my legacy to one of my children who will move into that home. I've made sure of that. And those will be the young families. And I don't know if anybody is taking into consideration, some people are leaving their homes to their children who will then carry on. I saw 600 students have left Birmingham. I work all over Detroit and surrounding areas in schools. There are more than that have left schools. Classrooms are nearly empty because this is not a good time to talk about class size. I think that we will suffer overcrowding because schools have been torn down. All right, I've said enough. I know we have a lot of people who want to talk, and I really thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And please, by all means, continue to provide input as you continue to learn.
I will be here from now on.
And furthermore, that any email that is sent to the Ms. Ecker as part of this process does get forwarded to the planning board and will, if it missed the packet this past time, will be included in the record, the official record of this for the next meeting. So please continue to send forth your comments. With that, we will move over to concerned resident. If you can please unmute them, but please state your name for the record, please.
Mr. Chairman, can you also ask for address as well, or at least street, neighborhood? We typically do that.
Yeah, I certainly will ask. Yes.
Hey now.
Concerned resident, please.
Yes, hey now. This is Adam Folby, and I'll ask a question. I don't have many comments. My question to the planner is, you mentioned a few times, not to disrupt single-family neighborhoods and have the seams on the edges, which I understand, not to split neighborhoods. And one of the drawings, Maryland, is yellow. It's the bottom left of the map. So I'm wondering how you picked Maryland of all the different streets to cut through the neighborhoods when all the neighborhoods around Pierce are not cut through. So how did you pick Maryland Street?
Sure, I'll address that. That one actually was a piece that is not the same as the seams that had, say, proposals for townhouses or higher intensity. That was the type where we know that the combination of lots where people buy up two properties and then build a larger home had stopped, and so there were some discussions that perhaps there was an opportunity to locate where that might occur in the future rather than totally outlawing, say, the resulting larger single-family homes. And I think that one was supposed to be was it on Maryland? That I think I just got an email on it. Let me see.
It's the bottom left.
Yeah, that was actually supposed to be on Stanley, so that was on the wrong street. It should be over one, and the reason that it was drawn on Stanley was because it has that median. So, the median street, might have larger homes in the far future, along it, but that's not intended for intensification of any sort in the proposal. But yeah, it was pointed out to me just now by somebody as well that that should be drawn on Stanley, and it was drawn on Maryland.
So you're saying anywhere with that light yellow is not intending to change single family. It is simply to allow two lots to combine,
Yes.
is what you're saying. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for clarifying that.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your comments. Janet, at this point, I'm just going to start running down the list here. We have a John Smith. Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Yes,
are you there, sir?
I am here. See if I can. Yeah. Well, my wife Joan and I live at 230 Linden Road. We're about 6 homes south of Maple. And frankly, I'm alarmed by this presentation. The seam idea would put these ADUs or duplexes at the end of our block. We're already just 6 houses from the end. And I think it would severely damage the type of neighborhood that we have. First of all, it's difficult anyway to get out on 15 Mile. You had a whole bunch of traffic and congestion. And what's really happening in our neighborhood, and we've been here for like 50 years. What we've seen is that a lot of smaller homes are being bought, torn down, and much larger homes built. And our block of Linden is mostly larger homes now. So it would completely change the character of our neighborhood in a not good way, I think. And I agree with what the preceding, or the first, what Eleanor Smith said, another Smith, was that a lot of the older residents are planning to turn their homes over to their children. And that would bring in younger people. In fact, we had on Shirley, which is the street just behind us, we had 3 large homes torn down and even larger homes being built there. And the one that's been finished or close to finish has 3 young children, I think probably, what? Under the age of 6. So I'm not so worried about not having places for youngsters to live. But I am worried about, mixing duplexes in with pretty large homes. Even though it's on the end of, it's on a so-called seam, it just smacks me. I mean, we've seen Birmingham grow in population, and 100 duplexes, or 100, I guess they're duplexes, get built in the downtown area. The population density keeps going up. And that's not why people come to Birmingham, to live in high density areas. So I find it alarming.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your comments. Thank you very much. Let's move along to Donna Garlitzer. I pray I pronounced that correctly. Ms. Garlitzer?
Yes, it's Garlitz.
Garlitz, I apologize. Please.
I'm just trying to keep track of what is happening around me. I grew up in Birmingham, attended Torrey, Seaholm, the whole 9 yards, and now I'm here caring for my mother. And my dad worked the city. And right at the moment, outside of having some nice people around me, I don't find that the city has much else to offer me. trying to go downtown and use it like I used to be able to? No, driving is ridiculous. The bump outs, it's almost like you're saying, don't come into Birmingham. And if you do, you stay in these outside areas, park there, and we'll bring you in. I don't like that. There's not a tree to be found. And I think about the young families that are here that you want so much. You've let so many schools go, giving them to Roper or the Lutheran Church or whomever. Didn't even think about kids coming in. Little kids getting bused to places when they could be going 2 blocks from home. That is not a family environment. And also, you want to expand, but I think it's important that we first take care of what we have. And right now, we're busting at the seams. I have 4 houses, and I'm centered right between them in a 3-house area that are all under development. Trying to get up and down my road, which is Banbury, 2 blocks, can be ridiculous. And the street has been thoroughly ruined. And even on the newer streets that have been put in, you're zigging and zagging if the car's coming the opposite direction because people park on the street. It's still a zigzag. We have too many people not using better sense at where they park, or we're not allowing that they park where they should be on their own property. But to consider growing us when you haven't taken care of what is currently present, I don't think that's a good way to go. You can't go forward until you fix what you have.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I don't think the divisions and things are going to help.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments. Thank you for coming. Continuing, Mr. William Watkinson, sir. You could unmute him. Mr. Watkinson, there you go, sir. You can please, no, we need to unmute him, please.
I believe he's still muted. Mr.
There
Watkinson, there you go.
Okay, thanks. Oh, yes. William Watkinson. I live at 1142 Maryland, which is 1 house south of Lincoln. I would just like to say that I find both of these ideas of rezoning to allow multi-unit housing and accessory dwelling units problematic. I really don't see who this plan is for. It doesn't seem to be for the current residents. This plan seems to benefit people who don't live here and might hypothetically want to live here in the future, and quite frankly, property developers who I'm sure would profit from building multiple units on what is now single-family homes. I don't think it helps the current residents. I think these proposals will both lead to overcrowding, traffic congestion, parking congestion, and a strain on city resources. I also believe it will detrimentally change the character of the neighborhoods. I've lived in Birmingham since 1996 and in my current home since 2011, currently raising 4 children in this community. And again, I live on Maryland, 1 house off of Lincoln, and under this plan, I could essentially a 4-unit apartment building could be built next to my property. I didn't move here to live next to a 4-unit apartment building. If I wanted to live in that type of community, that's where I would have moved to. And I don't think it's fair to me and other people similarly situated to sort of change the zoning out from under us at this time. Further, I just think this entire idea is based on a false premise. I don't see the need to increase density in Birmingham, regardless of any claimed need for housing. We are a very small city that is already incredibly dense. We are surrounded by larger cities that could easily absorb any increased population that needs to live in this area. And further, I don't see that this would lead to more affordable housing. A block north, several blocks north, Maryland turns into Watkins, and where Watkins and Brown meets, a row of townhouses was just built on a property that probably would have been about 2 individual homes. There was a commercial property there, but it probably would have been enough land for 2 homes. Instead, they built 7 townhouses, which obviously is nice for density, but those townhouses are $2.2 million a piece. It's absurd to think that increasing density is actually going to lead to lower priced housing in this city. You know, if the concern is that our city employees need a place to live, I'm sure we could probably put a little scratch together and pay them better. But I just don't think increasing density is necessary. I'd also like to speak to, I did notice that one of the companies involved in putting this plan together, DPZ, they're an urban design firm that is based on a philosophy of new urbanism, which from what I've researched tends to be kind of hostile to suburban living and tends to go into cities like ours and propose greater density. And it's sort of a one-size-fits-all solution that I don't think is based on the actual needs of the individual cities. I think they just sort of try to impose their ideas as they move from city to city. And I would urge the planning board to reject both of these proposals as this part of the plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins. Let us continue. Amanda Fishburne. Ms. Fishburne, if you are. Yes, Ms. Fishburne.
Hi there.
Welcome.
I live on Lincoln, right by Pierce. So I am a seam street, as you have so labeled it. And I really must object to the fact that you kept referring to my neighborhood as not a neighborhood. You kept calling it a seam, and you kept saying that your plans wouldn't harm neighborhoods. My information for you is that Lincoln is a neighborhood. My children live here. My husband bought this home in 1994. He has owned it for 27 years. We have children who range in age from 10 years old to 30 years old. So your argument that this may not happen for another 8 years is meaningless to us. We have paid for our house. Our house is paid off in full. Perhaps we would like to retire here. Perhaps this is our retirement home. But according to you, you want to change the essential nature of my neighborhood street. We have fought for over 20 years to calm Lincoln, to slow Lincoln down, to put in bump outs, to put in crosswalks, to put parking on the street, to make it a calmer, more residential place to live. And it has improved. And what I am seeing in this plan completely disregards what the Lincoln residents have fought for tooth and nail for over 20 years to calm our streets, to maintain and preserve our neighborhood. Lincoln is very much a neighborhood. And I bet you people on Eaton and on Adams and on these other streets consider themselves neighborhoods. They are not seams. They are not outside of neighborhoods. So please take that into consideration. Another thing I want to mention is you refer to the size of these multifamily homes as though that matters. I don't care what size the multifamily home that gets put in next door to me. Now I have 6 families or 5 families or 4 families who all have porches or all have balconies. Do you know how loud that is? I bought a home in a neighborhood, a single family home, in between 2 other single family homes. But now you're telling me that I could have multifamily units on either side of me with up to 6 families talking outside, engaging in activities outside. I don't know where they're going to park. I see there is no parking. I've heard a lot of the other residents, and I don't want to make the same points that they have, but I agree with some of my neighbors who have come before. I disagree with the premise. I disagree that Birmingham needs more diversity in homes. If somebody works in Birmingham and can't afford to live here, well, guess what? They live in Metro Detroit, and Metro Detroit is a very diverse area. There are all kinds of places they can live. I used to live in Detroit, and I taught in Bloomfield Hills. I could not afford to live in Bloomfield Hills, so I commuted. Wasn't that big of a deal. It was a 20-minute drive. So the entire premise I object to, And this idea that Lincoln and other seam streets are not neighborhoods is simply untrue. We have children that are raised here. We have children riding their bikes and roller skating on the sidewalks, and we would like to continue to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your input.
Thank you.
Thank you much. Let's move on. Jeffrey Otto, I hope I pronounced that correctly, ATTO. Please forgive me if I did not.
No problem at all. Everybody butchers my name, so I forgive you. I'm Jeffrey Otto, and actually my mom is here as well.
That's right. Wow.
We both live on Lincoln, but in different homes. So
Yes.
she lives West Lincoln, I live on East Lincoln. Gosh, I feel like maybe I'm sticking out like a sore thumb here, but I actually think that accessory dwelling units are a really wonderful idea. So my mother-in-law is retired, and I live in a very small house. It's about 1,200 square feet, and if she wanted to move to Birmingham, the only way we would be able to make it work is with an ADU. And I've been here for 11 years, but if I choose to retire and I wanted to move into an ADU and then rent out my house, I'd love to have that option. So I guess I'll be the first person to say I think that it's well thought out. And I think a lot of cities around the country are allowing for ADUs. And obviously, this is the planning board. So if anybody wanted an ADU, they would have to follow your stringent guidelines. So I don't anticipate this would cause huge problems. But what am I? I fix computers for a living. I'm not an architect. I'm not a planner. So I think it's a great idea. I'm sorry for all of those of you that might disagree with me. Now, in terms of Lincoln, I live next to a 3-story apartment building. I never really get to talk to my neighbors because they don't come outside, but there must be at least 20 or 30 apartments in this gigantic building directly next door to me. But I live on a main street in a commercial cluster. And, I think the idea of seams, not being an architect, not being an urban planner, is that you want to concentrate the development to the main streets. I live on Lincoln. Lincoln is a main street, so that you don't have the type of undesirable development in the neighborhoods. So I actually am speaking right now in support of the idea of the seams. It seems really logical. It seems really thoughtful, and I'm really surprised at how much disagreement that I've just heard about this. I'm going to turn this one over to my mom, and she's going to share her thoughts too.
Okay, so I lived in Birmingham for about 17 years on East Lincoln between Torrey and Adams. And everything that my son just mentioned, I'm in agreement with. So I was just here to attend the meeting and to give you my opinion, but I agree with everything Jeffrey has mentioned.
Yeah, I'm so surprised at a lot of what I'm hearing. Lincoln did a lot of traffic calming, and I think it really helped. And somebody mentioned having trouble driving down Lincoln in the morning pre-COVID. I've never had trouble driving down my street. It is a main street, but we have all of these bump outs that have actually helped with crosswalks. And I thought it was a really thoughtful thing that happened over the past few years. So a lot of these comments are really catching me by surprise, and I hope there are other people that agree with me. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Otto. I appreciate it. I should have remembered you from last year. Apologies on the name.
No problem.
Let's continue along. Mr. Haig, Andrew Haig, if you could please.
Hopefully that's unmuted. Thank you very much. Andrew Haig, Birmingham, Michigan. First of all, thank you, Scott, for laying out rules and, oops, been asked to start my video, beg your pardon. There you go, it works. Thanks, Scott, for trying to lay out the ground rules. And thank you, Matt, for trying to do a concise presentation. It was difficult to try and get through. I think you did a good job. Thank you. So a couple of points. Many are going to address the seams and some of the other points. I'm not going to touch on them. I think there's going to be a lot of comment about that. I want to go and look at some of the points in that presentation itself and just bring them up. So what I noticed on one of the first slides was if we're looking at the Delta variance that you're looking at in residents 2017 to 2040, it's only 2.5% of owners increase, but it's a 67.6% increase in renters. On the same page, you then go down to the bottom right corner and it says reasonably priced units, 450,000 sale price. With a quick peek at Zillow tonight, the median price in Birmingham right now is 520, so almost 15% higher. So I'm not entirely sure what the growth is going to be if the median price units today are 15% higher than your plan, and we're not planning on doing anything for another 8 years. So your median data is completely out of whack with what the market's showing right now, which kind of ties into a couple of other points. The 2 or 3 slides further down, there was population change forecast by age group. The age group 35 to 59 and 60 to 64 have a cumulative significant impact in reduction. That's the family size, where you have young children through are children leaving the home. So you're anticipating a significant reduction there, ones in the prime earning years that can actually own homes in the price range we're seeing here in Birmingham. I mean, I can throw a stone from my front yard and hit 2 houses that are listed at $900,000 right now. We all know what the mortgage payment on 900 grand is going to be like, and that's not fitting to a retiree's income, nor the income of the growth of 18 to 24, 25 to 34-year-olds. Doesn't fit. So something appears to be wrong there. I was also rather intrigued by the comment from Matt about the pushback. You mentioned pushback from residents many times through that presentation. That was interesting. It kind of implies that the data used to set the data up in the first place was significantly flawed. So if you're building on weak ground right now, there's architects and builders among us. If you build a house on poor ground, what happens? It fails. So if you had significant pushback because the data used to assess what the needs were in the first place was not correct, how can you continue to build a plan with what you've got? Because you're not going down the direction that's wanted. And that's what I think a lot of others are going to say. And then the last one is just kind of a curiosity question. In the ADUs, there was one, I'm trying to scroll to the right page so I state it correctly. Here we go. ADUs, third bullet point, require that the property owner lives on site in order to have an occupied ADU. Okay, so let's say someone puts in the permit for it, although I can walk you to rentals that don't have licenses around here. And they say, okay, I want to have an occupied ADU. As soon as they got the permit, they say, thanks, I'm moving to Florida. Bye. What's your enforcement? How do you then kick someone out? You have zero leverage now. So how can you put that down as a requirement with zero enforcement? Because that's what you're showing. You need to actually show the pathway to make sure that this is done correctly. Sure. Because quite frankly, rental enforcement today is miserable. I can walk you to a house that's a 2-bedroom without a walkout basement, and it's got 6 people living in it.
Right. So Andrew, to be fair, I mean, a master plan is not going to solve everything in the first draft, and rental enforcement, I will tell you, frankly, is something that the community in general needs to address outside of the master plan. Because to your point, I don't know that it's the ordinances are correct, but I do appreciate your points.
For the ADU, that I don't see how, if you have a plan, and I'm not necessarily knocking ADUs because granny flats are well known from where I grew up. There are flaws with the granny flat above a garage because stairs killed my father. But if you don't have a plan on how you can enforce the rule that you're laying down, then you don't have a rule that's worth the paper it's written on.
Absolutely fair.
That needs to address that as well. Anyway, enough said. Thanks very much. I appreciate you giving some time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and Scott, if I just to clarify the numbers for Andrew, those were all from studies that were done prior to when we started this a couple of years ago. So the prices have changed since then. The point of looking at those numbers is what the trend is and the pressure on housing that causes the price to increase at an accelerated rate. That's mainly what a lot of the background was.
Thank you. Let's keep moving along. I want to make sure everyone has the opportunity here. Natalia Dukas, I hope I said that correctly. Natalia, there you are. Welcome. I'm going to make sure she's unmuted first, please.
Natalia, you have to unmute. You there we go.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, good evening. My name is Natalia Dukas. I live on Suffield Avenue, but I am here as a historic district commissioner. I agree with a lot of points that have been made, but I would like to bring just a slightly different perspective. There's very little discussion and basically no specifics on potential historic preservation in the plan right now. I wanted to mention that our city has made significant commitment to historic preservation. For example, we maintain a certified local government status with the State Historic Preservation Office. Our city has a rich history. It has a lot of beautiful and historically significant buildings, whether they're designated or non-designated historical buildings. And right now, if you look at the map of the neighborhood scenes and overlap it with the map of either historically designated buildings, buildings that are over 100 years old, or buildings that are going to turn 100 years old by 2030, there are a lot of overlaps. And to me, then there's no alignment of any kind with the historical preservation for those buildings. I do think that development is very important to the city, but it is also very important to preserve the character of our city. One of the reasons why our community is so desirable is because of the character of our neighborhoods. That's why people want to live here, or one of the significant reasons why they do. So I would urge the company to perhaps pay a little more attention to our historically contributing resources.
Thank you, Natalia. I really do appreciate that comment very much. Lincoln Avenue or Lincoln Street is here again. An old friend, Frederick Acombe. Frederick.
Hey, how you doing, Scott?
Good. How are you, sir? Welcome.
Thank you. First, I want to start off by thanking you and the other members of the committee for your service to the committee. It's a thankless job, so I wanted to start by thanking you, and then jump into my complaints after I thanked you. Listen, I've lived on Lincoln with a brief respite since, well, it's been over 25 years. And as a consequence of that, I've picked up quite a bit on what it's like to live on the street and what's likely to work or not. And I sent Dana Ecker detailed email on November 19th. So I assume, and I hope you have it, and if you don't, I hope you can find it and look for it, because in that letter I laid out my significant concerns about doing anything to reduce the traffic calming measures that have been put on the street, which are frankly essential in order to make it a livable place to live. But that's not really the topic of today's session. So I'd really like to say just a few words about the scene issue, or the multifamily housing issue on our street. I live in a very modest 1,475 square foot house. It's been here since, it's almost 100 years old, and I happen to think it's a nice little house. It's the kind of house somebody might want to retire to. You know, it's the kind of house that I bought in the mid-90s when I had 3 young kids. It was a nice house for young kids to live in, and I didn't have a ton of cash at my disposal at the time. And my concern is that houses like mine, under this plan, would be torn down, and taking away from the traditional character of our city. It's one of the reasons why we like the city, is houses like mine. Even though it's modest, you know, it's a nice little house. And another issue I have is it's already difficult living on the city with houses that are small and are on top of each other, and how cars trying to get from the city of Southfield to Troy and using our street as a cut through. But you start adding more density to our street, then the noise at night, the noise in the morning is going to increase. And I don't know too many retirees who'd want to live in that environment, to be honest with you. I have other issues, but I want other people on this call to be able to have a chance to voice their concerns as well. But thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Frederick. I appreciate it. And thanks for your service to the city in the past. Let's continue on. Jack Burns, if you could please join us.
I'm with you.
There you are, Mr. Burns.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Matthew for his explanation of SEAMS. I now understand what's being proposed. The document itself is rather lengthy. But anyways, my wife and I moved into Birmingham 35 years ago, and we actually have plots in Greenwood Cemetery. So we're planning to be here for infinity. So 8 years doesn't bother us, okay? But what you're planning to do, I'm confused. I'm confused on the underlying strategy that's the part of the master plan. Is it to increase the population density of the city? Is that the strategy? Or is it to increase the number of single family units living in the city? Is it to increase the number or value of our limited number of existing residential home sites? Is it to increase the property values and taxes? This proposal of ADUs and small multiple dwelling units has just got me thoroughly confused. So at this point, I'm opposed to what's being said, and I just want to hear if it's got a good strategy and plan behind it. That's fine. But boy, I sure haven't heard it yet. Thank you.
Fair enough, Mr. Burns. Appreciate it. And we will get into that deep discussion in a little bit here when we bring it back to the board. Let's continue with fellow residents. We're coming down to our final 8 or 9. Robert Shop. Is Mr. Shop here? There you go, Mr. Shop. Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Wonderful. Please provide your input.
I'm on 1797 Maryland. I'm between South Lawn and 14 Mile. We've been a 25-year residence here. So we have a lot of experience with the neighborhood and certainly observing a lot of the changes that are going on around us as far as tear downs primarily. I want to echo the comments by a lot of the other residents about the concern for increased traffic, people who may be renting more so at a lower rental rate than a full house. This may be just my opinion, but maybe bringing in people that perhaps do not have a vested interest in the community as a homeowner does. I've certainly ran into a few renters in the area who, maybe due to the circumstance of the particular situation, but who were very disrespectful and just really couldn't give a hoot about my view or, any other rights that I feel that an owner in Birmingham would have. The other comment I would make would be I share the concerns about Lincoln. I traverse Lincoln quite frequently to get to and from, other parts of the city. Costco, for example, Woodward's the main thoroughfare, and I'm sure all of you share the same concern. To try and do the speed limit on Lincoln at times is a challenge with people that are right on your tail. And you're feeling the pressure to exceed the speed limit to accommodate the rush that a lot of people seem to be in. So I would share the concern that that increase in density is probably going to be a deter from that situation. I just have, just as a final, just one question. One of the reasons that was brought up for increasing the density was to make the workers and employees of the city to be able to afford housing in the city. And I just want to ask, what is the reason for that? Is that just a projected Semcog idea that this is something that all communities should make available to their employees, or what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, I'll just note for that, Scott, that was just an example. It's an example that some people can connect with in terms of, you know, what an income level is. So it's really, that is more an example than a reason.
I think the point was that you could perhaps understand what it meant when we talk about trying to find a home that is quote unquote attainable or affordable, that we were talking about, for instance, the firefighter or the police officer or the worker in City Hall, as opposed to trying to go for any sort of government mandated, you know, price points or anything along those lines. It was meant to try and explain it. Clearly it did not.
Yeah, I think the implication there, at least for me, was that was an objective, and okay. I didn't necessarily agree with that. So.
Fair enough.
Thanks very much for your time.
Appreciate it, Mr. Shop. Thank you. Let us move along, Mr. Bloom. Welcome back, Mr. Bloom.
Hello.
There you are, Mr. Bloom. Welcome.
Hi. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Good evening, everybody. Let me open my camera here. I want to thank everybody for doing this. Hang on one second. I want to grab my notes. Thank you. So there's been a lot of time working on the master plan, and we've heard a lot of really good comments tonight and a lot of very good, thoughtful comments. And I have issues with what's being proposed. Probably the biggest one is that the authors of this proposal wrote in their proposal that they expected there was going to be a lot of pushback. They used the word angry, that there are going to be a lot of angry residents that would be affected by this rezoning. And then they wrote, you should ignore everything that they're saying because it is a necessity to rezone these properties. So I don't know how many people actually looked at the document and the plan, but that's what it says. It says there are going to be angry residents, and that for the good of the future of the community, those concerns need to be ignored and disregarded. So listening to everyone, it's great that you're listening. I hope it gets taken into consideration, but the advice of the consultants that our tax dollars are paying for is to disregard everything you've heard except for the one gentleman and his mother who live on Lincoln. Another comment that was made by the gentleman that presented for the consultants was that this isn't going to happen right away. It's going to take time. And there are going to be lots of meetings and discussions about all of the changes. Every time there's a meeting and a discussion, I think there's over 100 people on this call, residents that are affected get upset or are concerned about their property values or their quality of life or their neighborhood. And so the residents have to come out, and it's a continual battle. It's either a frog getting boiled, or it's a continual battle of maybe a few hardcore, if you will, residents or people that have to actually not be able to trust their community leaders and have to actually pay attention to what's going on. And people paid a lot of money to live here. And we have to continually watch what's going on to make sure that our property isn't going to be rezoned. And then we have to fight it. And it's aggravating. And I don't think anyone here moved to Birmingham to sign up for going to a planning. It's nice that we have people participating, but I don't think people want to have to go to a planning board meeting every 2 weeks and make sure that they're not going to get screwed over. So I think that that's an issue that we should all be cognizant of. I have other concerns with this plan. Other people have addressed this more eloquently than I can. I also received, I probably need to have my hearing checked. after talking to Eric Wolf today because he was yelling so loud at me. But he's really upset by this. And he's lived with Maple Road down by his business in downtown Birmingham. And he's had massive amounts of construction and intrusion and attempts to rezone.
Mr. Wolf has provided input to this board through a couple of different emails to make sure his point is well heard, and it will be taken into account. We do need to continue to allow everybody to go here. Do you have any wrap up points?
I've said enough. Other people have said really good things, and I just really want you guys to listen to what people are saying, and our community leaders to listen and pay attention and to take that account and not disregard it as those consultants are suggesting. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's move along. We're finishing up here. Mr. Watts, John Watts. Is Mr. Watts?
I'm muting.
Mr. Watts, I think you muted yourself again.
Yeah, we can't hear you, sir.
Unmute. There we go.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll try to keep my remarks brief here. A couple of things occur to me. I live in the Hawthorne, Aspen, Linden neighborhood, and right in the seam. So I'm 5 houses off of Maple on Hawthorne, and so the multi unit dwellings that are going to go in that seam are going to be abutting right up next to my property. I am concerned about what this is going to do to my property values and the property values of everybody else who currently are living in the seam. And the second thing that occurs to me is that I don't see the benefit of increasing property density here in the city of Birmingham. Not property, excuse me, the population density. So it seems to me that the current residents of Birmingham stand only to lose from this plan. The only people who seem to be able to benefit from this are the developers.
Thank you. I appreciate your input, sir. So we are coming up on about an hour of community impact or input. We are going to take those that have their hand up immediately right now and finish that up, and then we won't take no more after that. We need to continue to move along. There will be another bite at this apple in a month. So those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, looks like 8 people have their hand up. We will finish up with that. Looks like we're at to Carl Kona.
Good evening. I'm Carl Kona. I live on Merrill Street in a high density area. And I used to live on Bird in one of the 40-foot lots. And I can tell you from living in that area that any kind of ADU there would just be disastrous for any kind of like neighborhood feel. And that was already commented by Matthew on the fact that those probably wouldn't be considered. I couldn't even consider, I'm on a 60-foot lot now, that having an ADU on one of those with my neighbor having one and that neighbor having one also would be like living in downtown instead of being in a neighborhood where I decided that I'd want to live. But my real problem is the idea that someone else brought this up, I forgot who it was, but they mentioned that it's great that the person builds it out for their mother, their aunt, their uncle, whoever is going to live there with them, and let them have a unit to be a family together with, and then they leave.
Right.
So the next person has it, and the idea is, well, someone could move into the apartment over the garage. They would be the owner, and they would rent out the main house. Well, I know plenty of people that live in Florida for majority of the year. And what a great financial way to own a piece of property and then also consider it rental by buying one of these units after someone builds it up for me. I own the garage, or I live in the garage unit. Not really, but I mean, I say I do, and spend the rest of the year somewhere else. And so there's nobody looking over the property. And I can tell you firsthand that when you don't have a landlord that cares about who's in the property, there's no consideration for the neighbors, as someone else has already mentioned. So the whole idea of even putting on 60-foot lots, these ADUs, which, you know, everybody here, I think that has had a negative comment, has mentioned the historical idea of the quaint town with the bungalows and the, you know, the tree-lined streets, and walking into town and being able to, you know, go to the market and go to Kresge or whatever the things that they remember from their childhood. And we all know that's gone. I mean, you can't go anywhere for a sandwich in Birmingham now. You know, you go to a Coney Island, that's it. But for most everything else, you know, you got to spend $20, $30 for lunch. The idea of just going into town type of thing is gone, and the ADUs of trying to increase the density in the neighborhoods is going to make the neighborhood feel disappear. And I know people are complaining about they don't want bigger houses taking over. This doesn't really address that. I mean, that can happen today without any changes going forward. So that's not stopping this. But the whole issue was the premise of who determined there was a housing shortage. I mean, there's a housing shortage on Corton Lake. I want a house on Corton Lake, but there's already houses there. So how are we going to get me to get a house on Corton Lake? I mean, I need to live there. No, I want to live there, but I don't need to. And as other people have pointed out, you can go into Grayfield apartments or condos. You can go 10 minutes from downtown Birmingham, and there's plenty of affordable housing. So I don't think we need the supply houses for some demand that someone's created. I think people want to live here because it's a very nice community. I've lived here for 40 years. So that's my issue, is that we address the after effect of someone has an ADU. What happens afterwards?
Fair enough.
Thank you.
Excellent point. Thank you, sir. Let's move along. Patricia Lang, if you're available, you are next. Ms. Lang, let's make sure you're unmuted.
Miss Lang, you need to unmute yourself. There you go.
There you are, ma'am. Please welcome.
Hi. I live on Floyd Street in Birmingham for about, I don't know, 36 years, 30 plus years. And I'm on the HDC and the DRB. So I really think the 2040 plan, I'm in agreement with what they're proposing. I'm not against development or the high density. I think that Birmingham, being on the Woodward corridor, the high density makes sense to me. My issue is historical preservation needs to be a more integral part and indeed a priority of the 2040 plan. For example, I would love someone to answer this question. How do we get and develop a political will in this town to make historical preservation a priority? Any way you could expand upon that, I'd appreciate, hearing about it. Existing older housing stock offers the housing diversity and affordability and maintains the historical character and practicality of the neighborhood, which is what we're talking about in the 2040 plan. So we also need to, in the 2040 plan, expand and develop historical preservation concepts. For example, homes must be reviewed that are, let's say, 50 years or older before granting permits for demolition. Another thing would be incentives for historical preservation, like making it easier to add additions to the back of houses to encourage the renovation versus demolition. Right. How do we develop partnerships between the city, developers, builders, architects, promoting renovation over demolition? Require all homes granted a permit for demolition to salvage all viable building materials before demolition, and encourage neighborhoods perhaps to identify people that might be interested in doing research on the homes in the neighborhood to do that research, which would develop and encourage pride in the neighborhood. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your input. Mr. Cohen, pardon me, Norm Cohen, if you are available. There you are, sir. You can unmute yourself. Please provide a brief comment.
Yeah, my name is Norm Cohen. I'm on 900 Bird Avenue in Birmingham. I've lived in Birmingham for almost 30 years now. I want to voice my opposition to the accessory dwelling units on 40-foot lots anywhere in Birmingham. I do feel that that density is uncalled for. I live next to, on either side, two-story garages. I think that the noise level and the privacy is going to be an issue. One thing I haven't heard is that with COVID-19, more people are working at home. They're schooling their children at home. I work at home. So I hear a lot in the neighborhood during the day. And I think that that needs to be considered as well. Post-COVID, I think that's going to continue, where the quality of life during the workday at home is going to be real important. There's going to be increased traffic, increased noise. I think security should also be considered with renters in the neighborhood and not knowing the neighbors. Privacy, there's going to be a problem with rental enforcement, as there already is, as that was mentioned as well. And parking is going to be a problem. There's really not going to be a solution for that. So for all those reasons, I am very much opposed to the accessory dwelling units.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I appreciate your input.
Sure.
All right. Wrapping up here, we go to Andy Kopitz, I believe. Please forgive me if you could unmute yourself, sir. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So my name is Andy Kopitz. I'm a Birmingham resident. I've lived here for about 6 years. And I just, I want to start off by saying that I really appreciate the level of thought and intention that's gone into the process of trying to understand the planning and the mechanisms of our community better. I'm a designer by trade, and so the research process is very much something that's important before we do projects like this, especially ones that are going to impact and have a lot of rippling effects on the people that live in specific communities. I'm a small business owner, and in fact, I run my small business out of the densest municipality in Michigan, in the community of Hamtramck, where I also serve on the Downtown Development Authority. And so, just personally speaking, being in a community where I spend so much of my time in Hamtramck, which has nothing to do with Birmingham, but is a very dense municipality, I can confidently say that there's still a lot of charm and character that is woven into that community, despite the enormous density of well over 10,000 residents in the community. And so I'm very much in support of ADUs for Birmingham. I live on Lincoln Street, 519 East Lincoln Street. I see the traffic and the kinds of things outside of my window that are constantly interacting and shaping my experience with the environment. I've never felt kind of negative towards it. In fact, I very much appreciated the improvements that have been structured along Lincoln. I think it's made it safer and a much more enjoyable environment and has added to the character and charm of what Birmingham is. But I would like to take a different perspective on ADUs. One of the things that I think is really interesting about ADUs is the residential components, but there's also this idea of business. Specifically, we're living in a time an enormous global pandemic. And so our relationship to work is changing, and it's going to change inevitably into the future. It's going to be very different. I don't think any of us can really prevent that. And I think it's already impacted our culture quite largely. So the way things are going to start to change is that families and young entrepreneurs and even people who are professionals are going to want to start working at home more. And they're going to want to do so that they can be more connected to their families and they can raise them. But they're also going to do it in spaces that provide privacy and a very professional place to practice the business and the work that they do. And so I think ADUs can very much be a part of that conversation. And it's not something that I've heard people specifically talk about. but it's something that I believe ADUs have the capacity to be very inclusive of. The other reason that I think, ADUs are important is that, I'm thinking about what I want to say next. I think that we have to consider how we can make our community a little bit more accessible to people who aren't at a $200,000 a year income, as so many families and individuals in Birmingham are. Maybe they're not all at that level, maybe some of them are less, but many people that live here are quite well-to-do and have higher incomes. And I think a more mixed income community by design is more stable, it's more socially and economically diverse. And the comments that I've heard from residents about it ruining the kind of architectural character of the community is not something that I agree with. In fact, from all the research and everything that I'm aware of with ADUs, they can be designed to blend in with the surroundings and the architecture, helping to maintain like the compatibility with established neighborhoods and kind of preserving the community character that makes Birmingham really special. So in addition to ADUs, I'm very much in support of this sort of seam concept with the porous borders between neighborhoods and some of the more dense parts of our community. And I just wanted to kind of show my support, not necessarily in defiance of some of the very good comments and feedback that we've gotten from residents, but to show that there are other ways to think about ADUs. And I think that should very much be a part of the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move to our final 4 people of the evening, and then we must bring it back to the board. Our next speaker is, well, just listed as Gigi. I'm assuming that's not Louis Jourdan, but if you could come on and give us your name, full name, and where you live, that would be helpful, and please provide your comments. Gigi, are you there? Or Gigi, if I'm saying that right?
Gigi, if you could, you need to, there we go.
I'm going to speak really, I'm also a member of the Historic District Committee, and I think my other 2 officers have covered most of it. I just want to mention that I noticed on the map, the denseness map, that one of the areas that is in the darkest brown or the most dense is the corner of Adams and Maple. And on that site is the second oldest structure in Birmingham. It was the original farmhouse. And so it sounds like the intention is to make it history rather than pursue the historical nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Gigi. And that's actually, those are neighbors of mine. Let's move along. Mr. Reagan, you are next. Paul Reagan. I know I saw Mr. Reagan earlier.
Yes,
there he is.
I'm here.
There you go, sir.
Paul Reagan, I live on Purdy. I won't reiterate a lot of the detail. There have been some pretty penetrating comments made so far. I'd rather address process. This is not the first time I have spoken to you, and this is not the first time you've taken feedback. There's been a lot of feedback. The first comment I'd like to make is, to me, it is not apparent that the feedback that you've received so far is in evidence in this report. There has been considerable prior feedback about the seams. And yet, I mean, to call it prior feedback is, I'm being polite. It's not apparent here. Yet, what's remarkable to me is this theme of the seams remains in the report. It's a flashpoint. If you care about this effort, if you care about the planning process, I would advise you politely to remove it from the plan. It will sink it. I mean, you're hearing very polite, considerate people right now, but it won't be so as it moves towards rezoning. That's one thing. Now, I was a part of the 2016 planning process. where Andres Duani was the lead on that. And he's somewhere in the mix here, although not out in front. Faux involvement, artificial involvement, a few flip charts, a few meetings, some comments, and then you push it through. Been there and done that. It won't work well again. And I know that the planning board is too well-intentioned. I'm not questioning the planning board's motives, but you are the caretakers of the process and it's not going well. Okay? And I think you're aware. I did collect some data and I'd like to address one point.
Briefly, yes.
The affordability of housing, and you know, it's the premise of that, why we need it, has been mentioned, questioning who asked for that. I don't remember anybody asking for affordable housing. But if one were to ask where the affordable housing is, I compiled a database looking at tear downs, housing starts, and home value for the last 10 years. And I integrated those data and started analyzing. Others have helped. You might be interested to know that 10% of the single family homes in Birmingham were demolished in the last 10 years. So, and then they, of course, they were replaced by homes which were far less affordable. So if you're wondering where the affordable housing stock is going, well, it's here now. It's here now. It's a little older, but it's rapidly diminishing. My concern is this. My concern is not on the families who don't live here. My concern is the families who do live here, who have paid for everything. They built the town. They maintain the taxes that provide for consulting services, provide for everything. But yet the consideration is almost an afterthought. If there is a way to enable seniors to stay in their homes, not in some alternative unit, they want to stay in their homes. Find ways to do that. Think out of the box there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Reagan. All right, final two comments of the night. Susan Perry Nolte, are you available? Susan Perry Nolte.
Yep, I'm here. Hang on. Sorry.
Not at all, please.
Trying to get my video to start. Oh, well. You can hear me though, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. First of all, I want to say I've lived in Birmingham for 30 years. We currently live on the corner of 14 Mile in Maryland. And by looking at the map, I think we're right in one of those seam areas. It would make sense that my little bungalow would be torn down for a multi-unit housing. I want to say that I agree with a lot of Mr. Reagan's comments. Over the last 30 years, if the objective of the multi-units and the rezoning is to provide younger families affordable housing, let's stop demolishing all the bungalows that I raised my two children in and taking those down and putting up $1.2 million homes in our neighborhoods. Because I don't know what young family can move into a $1.2 million home. So I totally oppose the rezoning and the multi-units. I think it'll ruin the neighborhood. I also agree with Mr. Reagan in the fact that we haven't done much thinking about older adults, and we haven't thought outside the box to come up with planned communities that are single level ranches. Before we remodeled our home, we went out into the Birmingham community to look for a ranch home. And believe me, there weren't that many around. So I just think that we're putting the emphasis in this plan on some of the wrong places. And we need to step back and look at what the priorities are and be creative and think of solutions.
Okay. Thank
That's
you very
it.
much. Appreciate it. All right, last public comment of the evening. Mr. Cicerelli, it all comes down to you, Joe Cicerelli. I think I saw you earlier.
Yep.
There you are, sir.
Video working?
Yes, absolutely. Please, I'll rest with you.
A lot of pressure there. Thanks for the opportunity and thanks for the presentation. My name is Joe Ciccarelli. My wife and I both grew up in the Detroit area, and then we moved around for the last decade or so around the country to Los Angeles, Milwaukee, in pursuit of education, careers. And then we recently moved back and back home by our family, and we picked Birmingham to start our family here. I think we might be the demographic that a chunk of this is built around to attract 30-somethings starting a young family. I'm 35, and I hope my wife doesn't mind me sharing her age. She's 33. I'll just say we weren't fortunate to have our parents have a house waiting for us. I think it's wonderful that people can do that, but we both grew up in small houses in Dearborn and Livonia, and our parents still live in those houses. We are fortunate to have purchased a really beautiful house on Maryland. I wish it were more modest, but my wife won out on that one too. One of the main reasons we liked Birmingham is because it feels like a city, but it also feels like a neighborhood. But in a city, there is a little bit of buzz and there's some people. So it surprised me to hear that, the people who've lived here a long time, don't feel the same way about that. I guess it's just something I'm learning. But I think we might have picked, if we didn't want a little buzz and a little bit of people around the city, we might be in Bloomfield Hills, in the suburbs somewhere. So I hope that continues, and I think the plan does a lot of that to continue that feeling. You did clear up an earlier question I had on, so I'm just going to note a few things I like about the plan. Making the area more walkable, embracing parks, creating more places to spend time outside, community building through some of the design. And I do think attracting a diverse population, both culturally, age, and economically is important. Clearly, there's a lot of disagreement on the ways to do that. And that's totally fine. And obviously, we've only been here for a brief period of time, so other people have strong opinions about that. But I do think that's important, and I applaud the effort to work that into the plan. Last, I'll just say it's not lost on me. I present integrated plans all the time. That picking out one thing or two things that you have an issue around can be hard to solve because one decision affects another decision, which affects another decision. So overall, I think you put a good plan together. I think everyone who shared their thoughts tonight were strong, opinions and great opinions and very valuable. So thanks for listening to us, and we appreciate that you're working on this so hard. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Ciccarelli. Appreciate that. And with that, we will bring it back to the board. I'd like to thank the public for a robust discussion, perhaps the most robust we've had in this process. So board, we have heard from the public on the matter of housing policies, heard from the consultants before that. It's time for some discussion on just that. Now, Matt, would it be helpful if we focused perhaps first on the numbers piece, if you will, that entire idea, and then moved along to the specifics of ADUs and the seams or whatnot, in order to provide some clarity of comment?
Sure. I just add in the numbers, which we said early on, that the point of housing in the seams is less about the numbers and more about the types of housing that's available, and the sort of pressure on the existing homes that leads to tear downs and higher prices and so forth. The numbers fit in downtown and the triangle, like we discussed when we were talking about Haynes Square.
That's an important point. Let's go to the board. I see the board is mostly muted right now. If you have some comments, you'll need to unmute yourself. Is there anyone who'd like to begin? Mr. Scheer.
Thanks. Well, it's a lot to think about. and a lot of very thought-provoking comments. So let me say, maybe start general and move more
By all
specific.
means.
To me, the plan, a plan like this is designed to, give a guidepost for what the land use patterns are going to be 20, 30, 40 years from now. And so we have to be thinking, again, in my opinion, about what the folks who are going to be living there then will need, what would make for a good, healthy city, not just what people want today frozen in time. I think that the goal of having, first of all, I think that roughly speaking, I accept the notion that there's probably pressure for, maybe 900 additional units. I think it is incumbent on us to try and plan for that and to try and guide where that goes rather than having an unfettered market dictate that, because there are a couple of reasons. One is, it may help relieve some pressure, price pressure. The second is that I think one of the people who spoke mentioned it, a community with a more diverse economic, more diverse family structure, more diverse age structure is a healthier community. And if we don't plan for it, we're prone to wind up with either too much or too little housing suiting a mismatch between the housing stock that's available and the groups that are looking for it. And lastly, it's incumbent on us to try and help this community maintain its strength by helping the school district by encouraging school population. School population the last few years has been stable. Before that, it dropped significantly as the baby boomers aged out of school. And we need not just school-age children, but we need school-age children in the demographic who are going to attend the public schools to keep the public schools healthy. And that's for the property values of everybody in town. So when I think about where that additional housing might best go, I think a fair amount of it realistically could and ought to go in the Triangle District. Some of it can go in the downtown. Some of it can be dispersed in the neighborhoods. I think the seam concept is generally okay, but I think that we need to look at, we need to kind of match the available land to the available demand. So I don't know that we've taken a look and said, if we were to fully build out the seams, how many units would that provide? And my gut sense is that if we did that, it would far exceed what would be appropriate to put into the community. So I think it may be a good idea to try and identify some areas that are better suited for the seams. And maybe rather than the high intensity and the medium and low intensity, and figure, I'll say this hypothetically, I don't know these are the right numbers, but let's say a third of the units along seams, if that might be 2 or 3 or 4 areas that have been outlined as potential seams rather than just throwing the thing open to the whole entire seam concept. With regard to the seams that are proposed, some of them aren't clear to me why. Some of them seem to be deeper than they probably, in my view, they ought to be. Along Southfield Road, there's some high density and there's some low density that go beyond just a lot or two. So I'm not quite sure the thought process of that, and it may make some sense for it. I'm, I guess, reluctant or worried about ADUs. I think they present a problem for enforcement and regulation. I think that in the more closely, the 40-foot, 50-foot, 60-foot lot areas, I'm not sure that they're appropriate and would work. I guess I'm open to thinking about if there's some particular place that they might be good, we could talk about it. But as a general matter, I'm not wild about the idea. And I guess in thinking about how we might appropriately help the housing situation, increase the density, I'll call it that. I encourage people to look at the courtyard concept and specifically take a look at the courtyard on Southfield. I think it's between Brown and Frank. And there's 4 or 5 units in a couple of lots. Really tasteful, never been a problem. I've lived in that area for years. I think that it's a little bit hard to figure out how we can legally and enforceably, regulate appearance. But if there's some ways to do that, I'd be, I'm reluctant to think that we just want to throw a big rectangle with the hip roof on it and say, okay, that's a fourplex. You can build them anywhere you want along Maple Road or Lincoln or anything like that. One further comment and one question for Matt. The comment is that I've spent a fair amount of time in the last few years in Denver in a neighborhood that was built around 1890 to 1910. It has a lot of infill, both housing and small 6, 8, 12 unit apartment buildings. And I gotta say, from what my observation is, it works. Whatever people there may have felt in terms of worry, it's a cohesive neighborhood. It's not a problem that I've observed. The question for Matt is, at one point late in the proposal, you talk about, I think the word was style agnostic requirements. What's that?
Yeah, so those are things such as having square or vertically proportioned windows as opposed to horizontally proportioned windows, or ensuring that when you combine materials on the facade of a building, that the heavier material like stone or brick is used below a lighter material such as wood. There's a lot of times, when you don't have those sorts of controls, it gets sort of put together willy-nilly, or that you don't have more than 3 materials on a facade. There's sort of ways to, if you have stylistic requirements, you can get very precise. But there's all sorts of mistakes that are made that you can sort of bubble up to some simple requirements that don't sort of shoehorn you into a particular style.
Okay, thanks. And then, I appreciate the comments of the folks on the Historic Commission. I think that's really important and something we ought to be paying more attention to.
Absolutely.
And one of the big problems is, it's a worry that the bungalow stock that's left in town, even with additional units, is under pressure to be torn down and built up with much bigger things. And you can see, especially in some of the streets between Lincoln and 14 miles east of Southfield, some of those streets are now 3/4, 80% large new houses in the last 6, 8 years. And the houses that are out of scale are the bungalows. But, the issue of seams, where they might be, what restrictions there might be, how they might be laid out, is an entirely different question than how we protect the existing housing stock and maintain neighborhood character. And I guess I'd like to think we can have some way, especially in some of the neighborhoods where it's still more original and less new, or new rebuilt, tear down. There's some way to preserve that. And I don't know if it's creating new historic districts or, just what we might do, but that's an area I think we need to spend some time thinking about.
Okay. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the public for their comments. My first comment is that I think that the population projection correction that Matt mentioned, to me, suggests that we need to go back on this issue, dealing with neighborhoods and seams concept, because I think probably the seams concept was floated at the time that the population projections were higher than what seems to be the case based on the Semcog reanalysis. To me, I'm not in favor of turning the entire city into one giant seam. And when I look at the map, I'm hard pressed to find areas of the city that aren't projected to have seams. To me, the population increase can be handled downtown, in the Triangle District, and along main streets like Big Woodward and perhaps 14 Mile. I would not touch Maple west of downtown. There's certain things I wouldn't touch. Lincoln, certainly west of the YMC area, all the way to the city limits. And I just think there are way too many seams. Some of them, to me, don't make any sense. I spent time going over the map. I had 6 or 7 areas that I thought maybe seams would be appropriate. I don't know that I need to spend time on them because we're already running late. I agree with Dan's comments on the ADUs. They kind of scare me. I haven't really thought all the way through them. So I'm not sure. I do like the courtyard concept that he's raised. We talked about it. I think the area, perhaps there are some areas that could work well. The area along 14 Mile Road, just west of Big Woodward, almost all the way to Pierce. But there, the courtyard concept couldn't be deep because of the depth, or it doesn't go very deep as it approaches the houses on Bird, but it could go in effect horizontally. It would also, I think, improve a lot of the sight lines for people having to leave their home and having to back out on a 14 Mile Road. I mean, I've almost been in 3 accidents there already. So I think there are pluses, but to me, with the correction in the beginning, I almost think that we've got a wrong premise to start with, and that is that the population numbers that were talked about aren't correct. And I think we really need to go back and fold the correct numbers in terms of making projections. I do agree that, to me, the biggest problem we have in the neighborhoods are the elimination of the bungalows. I looked for 6 years to find a house that had a first floor master, finally found one. And that's a huge problem for seniors. It isn't so much staying in a bungalow. I wasn't really interested in staying in the bungalow as I aged. And for a while, I lived in a townhouse, a 4-story townhouse with no elevator, and 45 steps later, I was ready for sleep. I was ready to collapse. So I think the problem we have is not just preserving bungalows, but thinking out of the box with respect to, as that population ages and they want smaller homes, how do we make it such by dimensions or lot dimensions to make it possible to expand and create first floor masters. I do like the courtyard concept that Dan said. I do think we need to go back to work on accommodating seniors. I also think it is an important thing to preserve neighborhoods and just not have way too many seams, as I see it. And lastly, I would say the 2 comments. Actually, preserving the historic features of Birmingham is a worthwhile objective. It's not built into the plan, and it should be. And then finally, as Robin Boyle has said on several occasions, the plan itself doesn't deal with post-COVID. And if we don't try to deal with that, we're making a huge mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. We'll go. Matt, did you have something really quick?
Yeah, just if I could help Mr. Williams comment on the numbers, just to clarify that the decrease, I think that would cause us to perhaps, from where we proposed, be maybe less aggressive on where you might propose multifamily, outside of those core areas that we discussed. That perhaps you'd need less of that, though the majority of the concept of the themes is about diversity of housing type more so than density.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Boyce.
Well, obviously, the concerns here are around, particularly with population and housing diversity. And we know ours is aging, and we know our school population has declined in recent years, this year included, and that we know that young families can't afford to live here as easily. So identifying those gives us this opportunity to try to do something better as far as the diversity of our housing in order to keep our population thriving. The consequences of not doing that, of course, will hurt our downtown. They hurt our property values and our schools. And so while this plan is very ambitious, and of course, not everything in here I think is exactly how it's going to turn out to be. Identifying, for example, what Brian just pointed out with the change of the numbers of the population increase projected, that like Matt said, will sort of change overall what is proposed for the seams and where we might see some denser housing and more affordable housing options. So I'm glad we got to that tonight. I do support a level of the seam proposal, and I do think that we should very much try to accommodate younger and more economically diverse people and families to join our community, because we need them. We all need them if we're going to continue to thrive the way that we do. And there's lots of successful examples throughout our city. I know we've talked about a lot of them, but even, for example, Henrietta has beautiful historic duplexes. And so while some of the diagrams and images are a little bit scary, I think, and 4 quads and 6 packs and these block diagrams look like something nobody wants next to them, we have to remember that we have a long way to go before we can start to before we will help to define, the heights and the setbacks and all of those other things that'll come in the future. I'm not saying that I know that 6 packs belong anywhere in particular, but I can look down Brown Street where there are beautiful examples of townhouses, not affordable, but townhouses that could be mimicked in another way in another area, on a street that is identified as a seam, for example, but at a scale that's affordable. So we have a lot of opportunity to work with that as this develops, I think. I want to speak a couple other specifics. I know there's been a little bit of talk of bungalows tonight, and Brian sort of hit the nail on the head, I think, when he said, he wasn't looking for a house with stairs. I don't think that bungalows I'm not sure that they're as savable as some of us would hope they could be. They're not desirable to older populations. Seniors don't want the stairs. The price point right now, it stinks. I mean, bungalows and in this area are being purchased by developers for $350,000, $400,000. They're tearing them down. And young families aren't in a position to pay $400,000 for an 1,100 square foot bungalow. So I think a better focus for us would be to look at the stock of ranch houses that we have that are more affordable. I've had quite a few clients in recent years, older clients, where we've gone in and we've redesigned a ranch house, turned it maybe into a 2-bedroom to accommodate their needs. People who've moved from within the city in bigger homes and wanted to downsize but didn't want to leave Birmingham. And those opportunities are slipping because those ranches are being purchased by those same developers and being torn down. I think we have a better opportunity there to help to retain some of our seniors as one of the elements that could go forward with this. And also it's appealing, I think, to younger families too. So we really just have to remember, I think, that it's so important that we make sure that we're appealing to a more diverse population with housing that can accommodate them, because 30 years from now, we will be sorry we didn't.
Thank you. Mr. Jeffries.
I was really encouraged to see the number of people participating tonight. I wish we'd had that all along, but hey, I'll take it when we can get it. I will echo sentiments that I think there are probably way too many places that we've got seams. I guess I'm looking at it as, here's all the possibilities. I think hopefully we can narrow that down to some of the more appropriate spots. And I also, to kind of maybe phrase it a little different, we could maybe change some of the focus that we have on ADUs to the first floor master. I see this constantly. And I will agree also on the bungalows, is that they're really difficult, and I don't know if we can do something, but they're really difficult to make into an appropriate, marketable first floor master. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we'd have to do something. So a couple comments that I had written down throughout the night. One, whether you agree that there be change or not change, demographics change. If you look at some of the charts Matt had, there's a tanking of the number of people with school-age kids, and there's a huge amount due to the baby boom of we're going to have older people. We can talk about whatever, that's going to happen. So that we've got good information on. Two, if we want services and shops in our town, there's a certain amount of population that has to be very, very close, particularly with the parking, but that of services that you don't travel to. We've already seen, Matt had a lot of good examples earlier in this process of low-cost evening meals. And that requires the guy at the apartment across the street to say, hey, I'm just going to go down and get a quick meal, versus the person who said, hey, we're having a night out in Birmingham and I'm not going for a hamburger, I'm going for, something special. So that requires, to support that, it requires us to be cognizant of, who needs to be living in our town and the amount of people and density close to the town, at least. Third point, where did I put third point? Oh, third point. And I've made this before, but I'll make it again. If you want to talk about density, and you've lived in Birmingham a long time, what this plan is proposing would not take us even close to the density we used to have. In 1970, we had 24% more people. So we shrunk way down. We're just coming back a little bit. And that was before you had internet shopping. So, we're trying to support these businesses and we love the town and we love to be, that convenience, but you don't do it with less people when it's so easy to do it other ways. Number 4, there's a lot of density we got to keep in mind, because a lot of times we say, okay, no, I don't want any of this. Well, you got to think about what's possible now. There's a lot of density that can be accomplished by right. I think Matt had this point earlier in the process. Again, the amount by right of density that could already be increased. So I think in some ways this plan says, let's kind of guide that a little bit so we get what we want where we want it. And it's not necessarily everything in the plan now. This is the art of the possible. But I think we shape this as we go into the second round here, or the second draft. My 5th point is back to change. If we don't do some change in this town, if we don't try to, there's going to be change. If we don't try to be proactive on it, then we may not get anything that any of us want. And then lastly, a couple things that I've noticed we're talking about. We have ADUs in our town. If anybody thinks we don't, we do. I've been in them. I've seen them. They're very hard to police. They're not legal now, but it is legal to have a full apartment above your garage today. It's not legal for somebody to be living in it permanently. You can have it as a guest quarters. You can take a guess at how well that's able to be policed. So again, do we harness that or whatever? I do have a lot of heartburn over the 2-story ADUs, because now you've got a 2nd story right on the edge of somebody's backyard. So that's an issue. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about the rental the seams. If you go along some of the seams, and I'll point out, I'll talk about 14 Mile. The city overall is 20 to 25% rented right now. But if you go along some places like 14 Mile, I think Brian brought it up from Big Woodward to maybe Pierce or whatever. Huge amount of rental, those houses in there. There's other areas where there's huge amount of rental. Some of these are not as well taken care of. So I think in some cases you improve the quality of the housing stock. Maybe somebody's going to take better care of it and increase opportunities for different kinds of people to live in your city.
Thank you, Mr. Kozak.
I'm just going to skim through my notes here and try to do this quickly. So, first, just this is really, really, really hard, and I'm sure glad we only do this once every 50 years. I am involved in facilitating master planning, but it's a different type of a master plan. It's for colleges and universities, and the way we look at it, and again, it doesn't work here, is we normally do it in 2 sections. One is we think 5 years out and then beyond. And it sort of makes it easier because you can typically look at your deficiencies and your needs over 5 years, which is a relatively short period of time. Once you get beyond that, it's hard to sort of predict the future. And again, it works in that type of a setting. I don't expect Matt to be able to pull it off here, but what makes this hard is we're thinking so far out. This part of the draft master plan, I think in my mind is overly ambitious. We have 4 square miles, and I think you've touched, I've not added up, but there's lots and lots and lots of linear length of seams in this whole thing. And we have 100 people there because you've touched many, many people in our community. And, is that necessary? I'm in my opinion, it's probably not. We've heard from some historic board folks that said, my God, your seam is on top of a 100-year-old house or something. And so obviously you can't get to that level of detail for the kind of work you're doing here, but I just think it's overly ambitious, and obviously it's frightening a lot of people, including me. Generally speaking, I think, I've lived here for 31, 32 years, 33 years. our neighborhoods are beautiful, you know, and I think Andreas Dewani, one of the things he said when he came to Birmingham said, my God, I work all over the world and you're often retained because there are problems. And how do you fix problems? You got a dead street, you got a dead whatever. And he's kind of like, what are you going to complain about? Whatever, you know, so we have it pretty good, and it makes it hard when you're trying to make something that's good better. And, you know, as I look at, I've walked a lot over the last many months. And I walk down some streets, like in the San Francisco district, and I think every house, 10 homes in a row, are all new. So they were tear downs. And I look at them, I said, they're kind of nice. They're big. They don't have big setbacks, architecturally, good quality materials. Some seem to be set back appropriately. They have nice landscaping. It works. It's comfortable. Even in areas that may have a lesser value home, have transformed streets, like in the Tory community, and it kind of works. But in other areas, it's absolutely terrible, in probably most areas. So, you know, I don't want to call it the low-hanging fruit, because I can't figure out how to solve it without having super architectural controls. But you know, I wish we could focus on those things, because I think everybody here, you know, has expressed concern and has been in agreement, and you know, so there's work to be done there relative to, you know, creating offsets or changing building materials, or you know, maintenance and enforcement and being respectful of your neighbors. And there's just a lot of that's not being considered. You know, I think so when you know, I believe the needs are, where do we need to fix this community? So it's the Triangle District, it's Adams Square, in my opinion, it's 14 Mile Road. It's, you know, there are areas that could use enhancement, and I don't think would frighten people, because it's underutilized. But, you know, if I think about my own backyard with these, you know, ADUs, which I'm not in favor of, I could have 5 of them built around me. And I prefer a sense of open space. I'm concerned about who lives there. I'm concerned that there's no parking to accommodate them. In a sort of romantic way, it's, you know, the granny suite and the in-law suite and all this, but, you know, it's on an upper floor. You got to get up there. How do you do that when you're 80 years old? You know, so for all the possible good things that could come about, I can think of 10 adverse things that come about. And again, it's not that broken. You know, if we want to accommodate our in-laws, can we find ways to make changes within the principal structure to accommodate them? Why does it have to be a separate structure that makes it, you know, closer into somebody else's backyard? So, you know, in general, I'm just concerned that this is such a broad stroke. You know, it's so ambitious, and our neighborhoods in particular, I think, generally work well. They could use enhancement, and, you know, some of the more ambitious things that you're suggesting we consider, I think, are appropriate, but maybe less on every scene throughout the city, but focused a little bit more where it becomes a catalyst for better development, quality development, where we might control the architecture and not have it end up in somebody's backyard who's invested in that neighborhood for, you know, a long period of time and isn't looking for change. So I'll conclude with that.
Mr. Boyle, you have not had your hand up. Did you want to stick your toe in the water?
It's 10 o'clock and I don't want to continue this too long. 111 people on Zoom is a fantastic advertisement for community engagement. We should be pretty pleased about that. On the other hand, 111 people on Zoom illustrates just how incredibly difficult this is. The first set of conversations were about Lincoln. People living on Lincoln had completely opposite views on that street. Some people were saying that it was easy to move along, there were no traffic problems. Other people were saying completely the opposite. And they're the residents of our neighborhoods. Some people said we didn't even call them neighborhoods, we dismissed them as seams, but that was never the meaning of that. The language was important. So we've got a Gordian knot here that's really difficult to unravel. Second point, I wonder if we need to really take a step back from trying in this master plan to deal with what I call the atomistic nature of residential living. If we try and take on board our neighborhoods in this way, which by the way, I think is a worthy attempt, but it looks as though it's a failed attempt at this stage. If we try and take that on, we're taking on everything that people believe in this city. It's their investment, it's their land, it's their building, and it's their right to do whatever they want to do with it. And underneath, of course, is this whole question of value, the value of the property and the value of the land. And people want to maximize that at a particular stage in their life. So perhaps we need to give pause to this and think long and hard about how we could actually produce, let's say, 1,000 units in the city of Birmingham over the next 20 years. And the chances are we'll probably have a better chance of doing this in areas that don't have existing single family homes. It's as blunt as that. It's simply as blunt as that. For reasons of control, for reasons of encouragement, and as correctly pointed out by many of the people speaking tonight, of enforcement. If we want to do this, we want the market to do it for us, but we want to be there at the table, which is what we're saying, then perhaps we need to really, really think about doing this on other property that will change its land use. So yesterday, I went for a walk, not through the neighborhoods. I went, guess where I went? You probably all know where I ended up. I ended up at Market Square, and I walked, not Market Square, Adams Square. And I walked round Adams Square, over and over and over again. And then I went to the back of the post office and I looked at it and I said to myself, this is where we've got to put our emphasis. And maybe even cross over Adams into the Southern Triangle. I don't know. That's equally tough. But I sit here listening to these people saying they don't want their neighborhood to change. I hear it. It's as clear as day. And I think if we don't think about this, then we're not going to be able to produce a decent plan for ourselves. Lots of other comments to make, but I'll rest with that.
Mr. Williams?
Just one comment, and that is that agreeing with Robin, if you looked at the Triangle District and including Adams Square, which of course some of us wanted as part of the Triangle District, if you go back in time, then the connection across Woodward is paramount to housing, which is accessible to our traditional downtown area. And so somehow, whether it's a bridge, as Mr. Reagan proposed, or narrowing by some mechanism on existing, but narrowing the distance at Lincoln and Woodward by eliminating South Old Woodward at some point, getting people across from the Triangle District to downtown walkable is a worthy objective.
I would agree, though. Every time you say bridge, Mr. Williams, I'm going to
well,
do something.
I'm not advocating a bridge. I'm simply saying there's a way to get across Woodward in spots which would narrow the distance traveled, particularly at Lincoln, but perhaps in other places. One of the original plans headed it all the way up to Maple. But if we're going to use the southern end of the, if you're going to use the southern end of the Triangle area for increased housing, you got to figure out how to get across at midpoint.
Right. I'm going to dive in a little bit on my comments here, and I frankly think, as I wrote them up earlier, and I've listened, and I've kind of modified them slightly as I've heard input from the residents. I think they actually will serve as kind of a summary, if you will, Matt, Sarah, as to what I think this board is telling you. The other board members can jump in afterwards and tell me if I'm wrong, perhaps, but I think it would be good to kind of tie this together for you to make sure that there's clarity. So let me just start at the very ethereal, which is your numbers. I'm glad that you indicated that there was a bust, if you will, with the number. The numbers you're talking about now, the 1,700, just out of, real quickly, I just went to the U.S. Census Bureau, and between 2000 and 2020, the city of Birmingham increased its population by about 2,000 people. So if you're telling me that we're going to have another 1,700 to 2,000 in the next 20 years, you're at least in the right ballpark, right? If we assume trends will continue. With regard to our impact on this discussion of attempting to attract others who might not be living here now, I understand people, residents in the community, hearing that, thinking, well, why aren't you thinking of us? And I guess I want to posit that in my mind, we are thinking of the residents of this community, because if we do not attempt to adjust for trends in demographics, we could find ourselves like other communities that are of perhaps similar economic strata, who are now closing schools, shuffling people in between schools, and are facing increased pressure to take school of choice from outside their community, and it's causing a great uproar. If you look at our school population, and I did some quick searching on the Birmingham Public Schools themselves, reported that since 2013, our school population has decreased by 5%. It is now at the lowest point it has been since 2006. That's as far back as the data that they provide, by the way. So while I do understand this is a regional issue, this is certainly an issue that we must take into account, as the schools in Birmingham are a major draw. And for those residents that are concerned that we're perhaps focusing a bit too much on these future projections, if the schools were to lose population and decrease in quality, if we are seeing pressures like this with a higher population of older people and lower school age population, that is going to impact all of our bottom line, all of our property values, and all of the other things that we hold dear here in this community. So I generally am saying that I think this board is agreeing with your general premise that we need to gracefully manage what we want to do with this. However, having said that, I think what you've heard clearly tonight is that we need to be more restrained in how we plan to do that. The plans you have for Haynes Square, which we reviewed last year, to me are a wonderful attempt at trying to connect downtown to the lower triangle. We could do more, but I think it's an excellent attempt. And as I said during that meeting, and I think I've heard others agree with again tonight, focusing any additional housing units in areas like that, away from single-family residential neighborhoods that exist today, to me, not only makes the most sense because we have more control over open space and the ability to put together overlay districts, but it also takes pressure off of those single-family existing neighborhoods who clearly feel that their neighborhoods, rightfully so, are in very good shape. We talk about some of the specific proposals. The ADUs, I really don't get them. I know they're cute. I know it's a fad. I'm a child of the 70s, and all I can think of is Arthur Fonzarelli sitting above the Cunningham's garage, right? I don't know how that plays into what we've been talking about all evening here tonight. I think there are a lot of potential downsides, as others have mentioned, and I think you've heard generally from most of us that if we're going to keep any aspect of ADUs, really have to think long and hard about where the lot conditions, the locations, enforcement, how it ties with rental ordinances, and all of those other things. Frankly, my personal opinion is I'm not sure it's worth it at this point. Secondly, with the seams. To me, your concept of the seams is really not necessarily all that new or radical. I mean, you're looking at streets that have become larger, busier. You're trying to reorient a different type of use to respond, right? I get it. That said, there are seams and there are seams. And while I think most streets that you have identified as a quote unquote seam, by your definition, kind of in between or the edges of neighborhoods, probably technically qualify. Most of what has been identified for, you know, low, medium, and high intensity changes to the residential density, I really just don't see. I don't think are appropriate. To be completely fair, I'll run through them quickly. There's no way I see how Ann Street is anywhere involved in this conversation. I think it's not something that we need to pursue in this regard. Furthermore, I even look at places like Lincoln, most of Lincoln, quite frankly, with the exception of perhaps a small piece near the commercial area, but most of Lincoln, most of Southfield, quite frankly, these are residential neighborhoods. These are residential streets. People are fronting on these streets. Even Maple, which you look at as the quintessential larger right of way, you know, kind of a local collector. Maybe it's the perfect spot for it. You've got a lot of room. There are a lot of single family residential homes on that street already. And I guess I just don't see the need or the point right now of attempting to reimagine those neighborhoods, those portions of neighborhoods. You want to talk portions of 14 Mile, maybe even Coolidge? I'm with you. I kind of get it. Those are really the edges of the community, quite frankly, the edges of the city. But the others, I'm really struggling with, and I would say that I would prefer we not even really focus on as a priority. If we're going to keep any sort of seams, and you want me to be supportive, we're going to have to severely restrict them, and where they are, and we're going to have a long conversation about restricting what sort of density you're talking about. I'm intrigued by these cottage courts, certainly, but to Mr. Boyle's point, I think we need to think about the achievable. 20-year plans, 20-year master plans right now almost seem ridiculously long considering the rate of change. In my business, we don't do a plan that's more than 3 years old or 3 years because the rate of change is so immense that I think what it points out is that we need to put together a plan that provides us some bits of flexibility, but doesn't go for the broad sweeping transformational change now, but allows us to build as a community toward where we may need to go and perhaps even pivot along the way. So to me, the priorities for residential would be Haynes Square, downtown, perhaps the rail, obviously different types, different massing, different styles, different price points, different controls, and maybe even incentives to help achieve what we're trying to achieve. But I would agree with what I think I'm hearing from the rest of the board that we need to focus those energies on housing policy more toward those areas as opposed to the existing single-family residential neighborhoods, which we're all quite, I believe, happy and impressed with. And one last comment would be, in the single-family residential neighborhoods that exist, the biggest priority, in my opinion, should be to look at them, to look at how we can, if we can, adjust our zoning ordinances, as you mentioned, to try and account for differences in character. I hate that word, but for their makeup, their physical makeup. And then can we incentivize ways to reduce or at least incentivize renovations and horizontal expansions as opposed to vertical expansions, if that's more in character with the rest of the neighborhood. I think it ties into aging in place, it ties into first floor masters, it ties into more attainable housing for young, potential young people. They don't have to move into the home with all of the perfect appliances, their first home. Most of us don't. So I think that's where I would suggest we head. And I think that's probably a fairly decent summary of what I think I heard. Board, I'm curious if there's anybody that thinks I was off point is summarizing that as perhaps our combined thought process here. Any pushback on that? I see thumbs up. Mr. Williams is not yelling at me.
I have nothing else to add, which is probably a first or a second for me.
Yeah, It's actually it's quite stunning. Any other comments from the board? Matt, Sarah, Jana, did you have any comments or any questions that you would like to ask us to further clarify? Where we're heading on draft 2.
The one thing that we didn't touch on was the lot combination question.
Yes. Mr. Scher?
I'm not sure. I had a little bit of trouble following the map and seeing where exactly the combinations were. But the one thing I would stress is that we need to be, I think, we need to be very clear that if we have combination areas, it's a maximum of 2. Right? I mean, not far from me, there's a street that has 2 homes that have been built on a 3-lot combination. I think it's terrible. It's really harmful to the character of the neighborhood. I guess I would want to walk Stanley and get a better sense of how that might look, but I'm certainly maximum 2.
Mr. Kozik?
I understand the concept. It just seems that where it's right, you can accomplish it now by asking the commission to do that. If we're trying to create density and affordability, we've just taken, 2 $500,000 lots and made a $1 million lot. I get the concept, and if this was a new town, the boulevards and the estate, and then, so I get all that. So that's my comment in regards to that. Mr. Chairman, can you just remind us, there's a lot of people here, so where would this go from here? This is a draft. Will there be comments, and we'll work through these chapters, and then it goes to the city commission, and the same sort of thing happens, or will there be edited versions of this before it gets to the commission? I'm confused about that.
Before I answer that, and I'm going to go to Jana to help me on that one, but before I do that, I have a couple others that wanted to comment on the combinations. So perhaps we could do that first, and then Mr. Kozik will come back if that's all right. Ms. Whipple-Boyce, you were next. Ms. Boyce?
I do have a question about the combinations for Matt. I noticed at least some of the areas that are proposed for the combinations are locations where the lots are wider already, 50 feet and above. I think some of them may even be 80-foot lots. I was wondering why, would there be any reason to be looking at lot combinations in neighborhoods where there are 40-foot wide lots instead? Or why choose the bigger with lots? I get the Stanley with the boulevard and that sort of thing, but I just wondered if any thinking might, be behind combining smaller lots, take 2 40s and turn them into an 80, for example.
I think what the discussion was mainly around the much larger homes, that sort of trend that was occurring, that in a way was shut down, yet still occurs here and there, and rather than having that continue to occur sort of ad hoc at random, to try to find places where that might occur more consistently. So it really did have, I think, to do more with some of the larger ones than, say, getting another 80-foot lot when you already have plenty of 80-foot lots around.
I'm pretty comfortable, just my opinion, with the way we do it now. There's a process already, and I'm not sure I think it's necessary to specify locations where we can do that. So that's my opinion. Thanks.
Mr. Jeffries, you were next.
Yeah, so that's neighborhood we're talking, that Stanley, at least is my neighborhood. We have, I think, Matt, you pointed out that that wrong street was highlighted. And thanks for the 7 phone calls I had to field for that. But so we already have kind of if you look at the first block of the east side of Southfield, Shipman, Birmingham, Maryland, and the west side of Stanley for the first block, and then maybe 1 lot on the other side of North Lawn. Those are already 100 by 130. you can put in probably a 6,000 square foot house on that. I'm going to agree with Janelle. As much as I love to see beautiful homes, I think it fights a lot of what we've said are some targets here of trying to get more people in. I will point out that I would bet, I don't have the data in front of me, but I've seen pieces. I would bet there are a significantly lower proportion of people living in $2 million homes that send their kid to Birmingham Public Schools versus some of the private choices we have, versus some of the houses that fit on a 40 or 50 foot lot. And so I don't want to fight that. I think there's plenty of places to build these homes now. And so I'm not a big proponent on the lot combination. I think there's certain here and there onesie twosie situations where the house across and the ones next to it are, and this is like this odd duck. But to designate a whole street, I think would be a mistake.
Well,
I lived on Stanley, so I'm opposed to that concept.
Thank you for that, Mr. Williams. Yeah, Matt, I'll just say that I think if anything, I agree with my colleagues that I don't know why we would pick just 2 or 3 streets. It certainly implies we're not allowing it anywhere else. I don't know if that's even something we can do, but I'll defer to you and the attorneys on that. Maybe just, if anything, you could provide more theoretical discussion of, not theoretical, more high-level discussion of why we may or may not want lot combinations in certain types of lot configurations or certain neighborhoods, or perhaps what some additional requirements we may consider for our ordinance. I think one of the things our commissioners had trouble with is they had trouble discerning, I think, what the criteria was for them to say yes or no on certain things. And not that we're going to solve that nut, but if we could, come up with a reasoned plan why we think they're better in some areas than others, even at a 1,000-foot level, that might help us in the future with that policy discussion. Okay?
Yep.
Anything else that you think we did talk about here tonight for tonight's meeting?
We didn't. There were some discussions around the cottage court, the sort of smaller courts, and so it seems that what I would get on that side of things is perhaps a look at where that may be possible or appropriate. Just sort of overall, as opposed to some of the other pieces. We totally, especially after our discussion at Haynes Square, and anticipated, on the whole multifamily side and reducing all of that. So, I think that all makes sense. But I do wonder on the, on the cottage court piece, if that's something to sort of absorb and propose in the next draft, or how we might think about that piece.
I mean, I think you heard some support for the idea. I mean, devil is always in the details for what what we're trying to accomplish with it. If it's adding to the diversity of the housing stock, we're doing so in a way where they're already allowing duplexes or other things. Those sort of conversations, I think, would be welcomed by the board moving forward, knowing that it is still a draft. Final word before we go to Janet, Mr. Jeffries.
Oh, just on the cottage court. I mean, we heard this first floor master thing. We've heard a lot about the seniors. So to the extent that we could demonstrate that the cottage court allows us with the first floor master, allows us, maybe a better way than doing an ADU over a garage kind of thing. In working with, and I can't tell you, I mean, it's more and more everyday clients that are looking for that. They don't necessarily need a big yard, which is, maybe the downside for some people for a cottage court, but, they want enough to have a little garden. And I think there's some places, particularly if you were near a park, that these cottage courts could be a great alternative that fit in with the community and allows, people to stay here.
Okay. Great. Now, Jana, to Mr. Kozak's question, I think it's a perfect way to wrap up tonight's discussion of the master plan. Help remind us all where we are headed next with our process?
Well, as you know, we have another meeting in February, the first meeting of the month, which is the second Wednesday of February, to talk about neighborhoods a little bit more, neighborhood plans and some of the multimodal improvements. We have envisioned that the March study session of the planning board, we would come back and synthesize all of the comments, make sure everybody's clear where we're at. Then the consultants would go off and work on the second draft of the master plan to incorporate all of the comments that we've heard all along and take some direction from the planning board in terms of where they want that to go. Then we would go to another public input process, not as lengthy as this one in terms of the number of months. Obviously, we were delayed by the pandemic as well, but over maybe the course of the spring and summer that we would go through and get some more public comment. We envision some different interaction. Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to touch base on this. We talked about doing some sort of interactive online public input process during that phase as well. We would also, I would expect, have a couple of planning board meetings to discuss it. Then it would go to the final draft. The final draft, of course, we're thinking, it's anticipated it would maybe be in the fall or towards the end of 2021. Obviously, we would have to notify all of our adjoining communities as well. There's a comment period under the state statutes that we would have to follow. And then it would come to the planning board for a formal public hearing, and then the city commission for a formal public hearing. City commission would be the ones that would ultimately decide to adopt a plan in whatever form, if any. That's how we're looking at. To the point of somebody brought up at the beginning of the meeting, would we have a joint meeting? I think we're probably looking at having another joint meeting with the city commission, hopefully maybe at the end of March. Would be a good time to do it after the planning board has been able to summarize what the thoughts were and the comments were that were received between the first and second draft. And then we do also have a joint meeting with the city commission every June. So that would be another point at which we could touch base with them as well.
Mr. Williams, any questions?
Yeah, no, it's not a question. It's just, I think it's important to note when this master plan process started, it was essentially a different city commission, at least by 3. So I think it's important that this meeting that Janice just talked about take place and we get the input of the city commission, particularly those members of the city commission that weren't around in the beginning.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, board. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Sarah. I would like to thank the public as well for all of your input and your interest in this important matter. Thank you so much for this. You will have more opportunities, as you just heard. We will continue to move forward, and this plan will continue, and it will be updated with all of this information moving forward as we move into the later parts of this year. So with that, let me close the conversation related to the master plan. Jana, I see a pre-application discussion has found its way to the agenda.
Yes, and I am not certain if that person is here, but they indicated that they wished to speak. So if you could raise your hand if you're here for that pre-application discussion, that would be great. And number one, and then we also do have, Nick has an administrative approval ask of you before we wrap up.
That's just not smart.
The answer is no. What's the question?
Do we have anybody representing the pre-application? I don't see anybody raising a hand.
I don't see any raised hands. Either they forgot or it got way too late for them. I don't know.
Brown and Watkins?
Yeah, I don't see any hands going up.
No, I don't either.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, let's move to, you've got an administrative approval request then.
Okay, I'll go, and Brian, I promise it's quick. This is for Brooklyn Pizza. The gist of it is he is hoping to expand his already approved outdoor dining area essentially to the north and maybe east, depending. I've got a couple drawings here just to share. In general, he's got 2 options he's proposed for the expansion. You can see option one is simply just this little polygon to the north ending right at their front door. I've already spoken with him about the maximum seating, the 5-foot pedestrian path requirements. Those will all be handled throughout this process. But there's a second option seating plan that wraps around the building into the front that they'd like to entertain, and they've indicated is their preferred option. Here you can see it with the seats drawn in and some of the dividers drawn in. Quite simply, without getting into the nitty-gritty, is this something that the planning board would entertain through administrative approval, or would it be something that you'd rather see in person? And I'm not sure what Jen and I would have to talk about, either a full SLUP review, or if we can get him in for just something like a design review. That's up in the air. But in general, we've done seating for bistro administratively before, but not really before we ask you. So
does any board member have any opinion on whether we would allow administrative on this? Sorry, with the screen share, it's harder to see you guys. Oh, Ms. Boyce.
Well, I just wanted to say that, you know, I don't personally have a problem with it, but there's been so much controversy around bistros being too big for the bistro concept, and you know, excessive amount of outdoor seating that doesn't really qualify them as a bistro anymore. So my question, I guess, is would the city commission ever be interested in knowing that this was going on? Because I'm not sure they would be so supportive.
I'm sure they would, and Jana can probably answer that a little bit better. But the only way they'd probably get a real piece of it is if we were to do a special land use permit update.
Amendment.
If we were to do it, yeah, amendment, yeah. So that'd be the only real way that they would get a piece. So I guess that's part of the decision-making process.
And keep in mind, the city commission has put a maximum on outdoor dining now in response to that very point that some of the outdoor dining spaces were getting rather large. So there is a max of 65 seats outdoor dining now, other than not in the COVID rules, not during the pandemic, but non-COVID.
What would this put them at?
No.
65?
I haven't quite counted. I got this late, I'll admit, but I have told him that any plans will be capped at 65. That's the rule. That's what he'll be held to. So he knows.
Okay.
I saw hands go up from Mr. Boyle.
Yeah, for clarification, I know it's late. Are you saying it's a maximum of 65 outdoor seats?
Correct.
Yeah.
That's the rule now. Now the ones that were approved prior to that can stay.
Sure. Just eyeballing what you flashed in front of us, there's not 65 additional seats.
65 additional, what about the
65 total.
Sorry. I don't believe there are 65 additional total seats in that location, including the possibility of some tables on Maple. It just wouldn't fit, in my opinion. But you better count them, Nick.
Mr. Kozin.
You put up the plan real quick again. I mean, to me, it looked like expanding their existing seating on the west. Seemed fine to me. Once it made the turn on the north side of the building to the left of this image, you know, I was beginning to think, like, what are some of those rectangles and
right.
And I don't know that we have that condition on Maple. You know, there's Dick O'Dow's that has seating, but it's not in that form. You know, is it going to look a little so? At least for me, I'm fine administratively expanding that initial piece that Nick referenced as the polygon. Once it made the turn, I became a little bit more concerned about some of those other elements and is it looking, you know, like it wasn't really planned. So
just a reminder that Maple Road didn't have very wide sidewalks before until it was redone. So there probably wasn't much room to do anything either.
I'll echo what Bert says though and say that I'm probably okay with administrative approval of option one, which is just that small polygon right there. Knowing that you'll demonstrate the 5-foot pedestrian path and the 65 seat cap, et cetera. I'm not comfortable administratively approving option two, just because I don't know what it's going to do to Maple. I know Maple has changed. I don't have the same sense of what it is yet. I hate really administrative approvals like this because you throw a plan in front of us for 2 minutes and, we're supposed to understand everything about it. So I would not support administrative approval of the option two. I think that if they want it, they got to submit. Frankly, I don't know that I would support it, but I'd have to look at the details to really see what that's all about.
Okay.
I don't know if anybody else has a strong opinion, but I've heard a couple of folks throw one out. Is that a fair general statement?
Yep.
Mr. Scher, was that a yes or
Yeah, no, I agree. The option one administrative is fine as a matter of process. Option two should not be administratively approved in my view.
Agreed.
Great.
Fair enough.
Good.
Works for me. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, moving along. Any other communications, Jana? Anything else we need to be aware of? Hopefully
Just
no.
one other thing I wanted to remind everybody, or in case you didn't remember or didn't realize, the long range planning meeting is coming up on January 23rd. That will be via Zoom as well, so you can stay in the comfort of your home and watch it. But we will have several items on. The master plan update, of course, is going to be one of the discussion items. So if you care to tune in, it's Saturday, January 23rd.
You have a time?
Generally, it starts at 8:30 or 9 o'clock. I haven't seen the agenda, the final copy of the agenda. It's not been before 8:30, so I would say 8:30, 9 o'clock.
I was also wondering what time the plan, if the agenda says planning's between this time and that time, finance and so on.
The draft,
that's the whole day.
the draft one that I saw had us at like 10:15 or something.
So 11:30.
Maybe. It was 10 something, so that was the ballpark.
Yeah, 10:30 Rocky Mountain time.
Yeah.
AM or PM.
Yeah,
All
right.
Gianna, well, how about a draft agenda for January 27th?
Yes. Well, we do have, bear with me for a minute. I have to pull up my my chart. But we definitely have 219 Elm, phase 2 of the All Seasons, because they have to come back for the SLUP due to that noticing issue. So they're coming back. We have Fruition that was postponed to that, I believe, for 856 North Old Woodward. We also have 2101 East 14 Mile, which is the orthodontic office, that new building that was proposed on the vacant parking lot. Again, they've made some changes. They've shifted the footprint a little bit and this kind of thing. And so we told them they had to come back. And then we were also to have the Hilton, or the former Hilton site, the 35001, I keep calling it that, sorry, 35001 Woodward site. But they've sent me an email and stated that they wish to be postponed because they're still trying to work with the Hunter House. So they're trying to resolve that before they get here.
Oh, good.
Okay, so there'll be 3 items: 856 North Old Woodward, 219 Elm, and 2101 East 14 Mile.
All right. If it's one thing, orthodontists just love to tinker, so I'm sure that's what's going on. All right, board, I have nothing. Any other new business or anything else the board wishes to bring up? Seeing none, I thank you all for your comments and your work tonight. Thank you to Jana and to Nick and everybody, and to all of the public that stayed with us. Thank you much. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Been here.